Deep in the forgotten corners of Texas, there are towns so remote that help never comes, and sometimes neither do explanations. On Vesper Shroud, we uncover 10 true horror stories from remote Texas small towns, based on real events locals still refuse to talk about. These stories weren't meant to leave Texas, and once you hear them, you'll understand why. Story 1. Town that went silent overnight. I should have died in that place. Every part of me knows this with absolute certainty. The only reason I am telling you this now is because I need someone to understand what happened. I need someone to know the truth before they come looking for others like me. What if you drove into a town where nobody lived anymore, but they never left? What if every sign of life, the warmth of a running car engine, the steam rising from a cup of coffee, the soft glow of a television screen, remained exactly as it was, frozen in time, but the people had simply vanished? This is what I found on Highway 285, in the heart of West Texas, on a night I'll never forget. My name is Robert Chandler, and I've spent the last 4 years trying to convince myself that what happened in Millbrook was just a nightmare. But I know better now. The details have never faded. The fear is still there, creeping at the edges of every dark room. I was driving from Dallas to Albuquerque late on a Thursday night in October. Married life, desk job, 2 kids at home. Nothing remarkable. I was tired, my eyes heavy from staring at the highway for 6 hours straight. The sun had dipped below the horizon around 7 o'clock, and by 8:30, I was the only thing moving on that stretch of road. Nothing but desert, scrub brush, and endless darkness in every direction. The nearest city was an hour behind me. The next town was supposed to be Millbrook, population 1,847 according to the sign, about 30 minutes ahead. That's when my radio died. Not slowly, not fading in and out. One moment I was listening to a country station, some song about broken hearts and whiskey, and the next moment, there was only static. Dead, white noise. I punched the dial, searching for another station. Nothing but empty frequencies. I checked the AM band. Same thing. Absolute, creepy silence when I switched it off. The unsettling feeling crept up my spine like ice water. Millbrook appeared on the horizon as a scattered collection of lights. Small clusters at first. A gas station. A diner. What looked like a motel. As I got closer, I began to see the outline of a downtown area. Nothing too impressive. Just the skeleton of an old West Texas town that had seen better days. Faded brick buildings. Streetlights casting yellow pools onto empty roads. But there were lights in the windows of houses. Cars parked in driveways. All the signs that people lived here. The first thing I noticed was the traffic light at the main intersection, blinking red. Empty roads, and the light was still changing, cycling through its mechanical rhythm even though there was nothing on the street to obey it. I drove through slowly, my headlights cutting through the darkness, sweeping across storefronts. The hamburger restaurant on the corner. The Millbrook Diner. I could see the sign, had every light on inside. I could see the booths, the tables, the counter. The deep fryer in the open kitchen was glowing orange. But when I looked through the window as I drove past, there wasn't a single person visible. Not behind the counter, not in the booths, not in the kitchen, just an empty, terrifying restaurant with all its lights burning and its machinery running. My stomach tightened. I should have turned around right then. Some instinct deeper than reason was screaming at me to leave, to drive back the way I came. But I didn't. I kept going, driving deeper into Millbrook, telling myself that maybe it was just late, that people were at home, that I was being paranoid. The side streets were lined with houses, and what I saw made my hands grip the steering wheel so hard my knuckles went white. In nearly every house I passed, I could see lights on inside. Warm, golden lights spilling through the windows. Some houses had their garage doors open, cars sitting inside. One house had a television flickering in the front room, casting blue light against the walls. I could see movement on the screen. The flashing of a program, maybe the news, maybe a game show, but no person was watching it. A bicycle lay on its side in one front yard. One wheel still slowly spinning as if someone had just dropped it seconds before. The fear became something tangible then, something I could taste in the back of my mouth like copper. I pulled into the parking lot of a gas station called Murphy's, a small convenience store with those old-fashioned pumps that haven't been updated since the 1990s. The lights inside were on. I could see a cup of coffee sitting on the counter, steam still rising from it. Behind the counter, The register was open, bills scattered around it like someone had been in the middle of a transaction and simply walked away. I sat in my car for what felt like an eternity, maybe 30 seconds, just staring at that coffee cup. The steam kept rising. It was still hot. Whatever had happened here, it had happened recently. Minutes ago, maybe. Not hours. It's when I heard it. A sound like wind, but not quite wind. It came from somewhere deeper in the town. A low, rising moan that seemed to come from the earth itself. It started as a whisper and grew louder, building in intensity until it sounded almost like a voice. A terrifying, chilling sound that made every nerve in my body scream to run. I started my car without thinking and drove further into the town, away from the sound. I don't know why I drove toward it instead of away from it. Later, I would try to rationalize it. Curiosity, the need to understand, the inability to accept that something was genuinely wrong. But the truth was simpler and more horrifying. The sound was pulling me toward it, and I was powerless to resist. The buildings grew taller and older as I approached the center of town. Old brick structures with hollow windows, businesses that had clearly closed years ago. A theater with a marquee that hadn't been updated in decades. A bank with its doors hanging open, and everywhere, signs of abandonment mixed with signs of recent life. I passed a car with the engine still running, the headlights on, the door open. An old Chevrolet pickup, maybe 10 years old, sitting in the middle of the street as if the driver had simply stepped out and forgotten to come back. The sound was getting louder. That terrible, wailing moan that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at once. I pulled my car to the side of the street and turned off the engine. In the sudden silence, I could hear only my own breathing, ragged and panicked. I sat there, hands shaking, trying to decide if I should get out of the car or drive away. Everything in me wanted to drive away, to forget this place, to convince myself later that I had imagined everything. But then I saw something that made my blood freeze solid in my veins. There was a figure standing in the middle of the street, about 50 feet from my car. A person, finally, a person, but something was wrong. The figure wasn't moving. It was just standing there, facing away from me, completely still. The streetlight above cast its shadow long and thin across the asphalt. I could see it was wearing dark clothes, but I couldn't make out any details. No hands visible, no head clearly defined, just a silhouette, perfectly motionless. I waited, my breath caught in my throat, for the figure to move. To turn around, to acknowledge that it knew I was there. It didn't. I opened my car door slowly, the hinge creaking in the quiet night. The sound seemed impossibly loud. I stepped out onto the street, my legs unsteady beneath me. The figure still didn't move. I called out, my voice hoarse and cracking from fear. I asked if someone was there, if they needed help. My voice echoed off the buildings, the words sounding small and helpless against the vastness of the empty town. No response. The figure remained perfectly still. I took a step toward it, then another. Every instinct was screaming that this was a mistake, that I was walking toward something awful and unknowable. But I couldn't stop. The fear had transformed into something else, a desperate need to understand, to see the face of whatever was standing in that street. When I was about 30 feet away, the figure began to turn. It moved slowly, deliberately, pivoting on its feet with a grinding motion, like someone whose joints were stiff from not moving. I could see the outline of its head becoming visible, the shape of shoulders beneath fabric that seemed to hang wrong, loosely, like it was draped over something that wasn't quite human. And then I saw the face. I spent 4 years trying to describe that face to myself, trying to find words that make sense. There are no words. What I saw wasn't the face in any way that my mind was prepared to accept. It was pale. Yes, impossibly pale, like something that had never seen the sun. But it was the eyes that broke something in me. They were too large. They covered too much of the face. They were black, not dark brown, not navy, but absolute black, like looking into wells that went down forever. The thing that wore the shape of a person opened its mouth, and that terrible sound came pouring out again. That wailing, chilling moan that had drawn me deeper into the town. It was a voice. I understood now. Something was trying to speak, but it didn't have the anatomy to produce human speech. I ran. I remember running back to my car. I remember the motion of it. One moment I was standing in the street, staring at that impossible thing. and the next I was in my car, slamming the door and hitting the accelerator. The tires squealed as I spun the car around and drove away from the center of town as fast as I could, my headlights bouncing wildly off the buildings in the street. In my rearview mirror, I could see it. The figure was standing in the middle of the street where I left it, watching me leave. And as I watched, more shadows began to appear behind it. More of those silhouettes, stepping out of buildings and driveways, all turning to face the direction I was fleeing. Dozens of them, maybe more, all perfectly still, all with those terrible, two large eyes I could sense even though I couldn't see them clearly. I didn't stop the car until I had crossed back across the town limits. My hands were shaking so badly I could barely keep the vehicle on the road. The gas station sign disappeared behind me, and I pressed the accelerator harder, needing to put as much distance between myself and Millbrook as possible. It wasn't until I was nearly 10 miles away that my radio crackled back to life. The same country station, the same song, exactly where it had left off. As if no time had passed at all. I pulled off the highway at the next rest area and sat in my car, unable to move, unable to think coherently. It was 3 a.m. I called the Texas State Police and reported what I'd seen. A dispatcher took my information with a strange, flat tone. She asked me where I was. She asked me to describe Millbrook. And then, in a voice that made my skin crawl, she asked me if I was sure about what I'd seen. The police arrived 40 minutes later. A single patrol car, lights off, approaching with an unsettling slowness. The officer who got out was a young man, maybe 30, with a professional demeanor that felt rehearsed. He took my statement. He nodded as I described the empty town, the houses with lights on, the thing I'd seen in the street. When I finished, he told me something that I'd never been able to forget. He said Millbrook had been evacuated 4 weeks earlier. A gas leak, he explained, something to do with the old wells that used to supply the town with drinking water. The residents had been moved to temporary housing in other cities. The town was supposed to be completely empty. He said no one should have been there. I asked him why the houses had lights on, why there were cars with running engines, why there was coffee still hot in a gas station cup. He didn't have an answer to that. I asked him if I could take him into the town, show him the thing I'd seen, prove that I wasn't insane. He said it wouldn't be necessary. He said the state had already documented unusual phenomena in the area. He said they had their own scientists looking into it. He said I was safer if I forgot about it and went back home to my family. And then he said something that still wakes me up at 3 a.m, gasping for breath. He said, come back here. Whatever you saw, whatever is in that town now, it doesn't want to be seen. And if it decides you've seen too much, it might come looking for you. I drove to Albuquerque and completed my business. I went home. I haven't told anyone what I saw, not even my wife. I told her the truck had mechanical problems, that I turned around and found another route. She didn't question it. People are good at not asking questions when the answers might terrify them. But I've been researching. In the month after that night, I found scattered reports online. Disappearances across West Texas dating back years. Towns that emptied out suddenly with no official explanation. People who had gone to those towns and come back changed, unable to describe what they experienced, unwilling to discuss it, often checking themselves into psychiatric facilities within days. I found a website dedicated to unexplained phenomena in rural Texas. It had a page about Millbrook. The page had been updated 3 weeks ago. Someone, anonymous, posting from an unknown location, had left a message. It was only a few sentences long, but it burned itself into my mind. The message said, they're still there. They've always been there. The humans who lived in Millbrook disappeared because they finally saw what had been living alongside them. The town didn't empty because of a gas leak. The government evacuated it because they knew the truth. There are things in West Texas that wear the shape of nothing because they haven't learned to be human yet. Dawn, to look for Millbrook. Dawn, to try to prove what you've seen. And pray to whatever God you believe in that they don't, to become curious about what you look like. I'm telling you this story because the dream started last week. I dream of empty streets and pale faces with eyes that see everything. I dream of that sound, that terrible wailing that seemed to come from the earth itself. And in the dreams, I see things standing in the darkness outside my house, looking in through the windows. They haven't to try to come inside. Not yet, but they were watching. They were always watching. I asked my neighbor yesterday if she noticed anyone unusual in the neighborhood. Strangers standing in yards, staring at nothing. She gave me a strange look and said no, but I saw something in her expression that frightened me more than anything I saw in Millbrook. She looked like she was lying. Last night, I woke at 3 a.m. to find my bedroom door open. I never leave it open. The hallway was dark, but I could make out a shape standing in the doorway. Just standing there, perfectly still. When I turned on the light, there was nothing there. Just an empty hallway and an open door. My wife didn't wake up. She was sleeping so deeply that I couldn't rouse her, no matter how much I shook her. When she finally woke at 6, she didn't remember me trying to wake her. She didn't remember anything unusual happening during the night. I am writing this as a confession, a warning, and maybe a prayer. If you read driving through West Texas late at night and you see a town called Millbrook, do not stop. Do not try to help anyone. Do not look at the faces of the figures in the street. Just keep driving. Get away as fast as you can. And whatever you do, don't ever come back. Because I figured out something in these 4 years of research and terror. The thing that scared me most in that town wasn't that it was empty. It wasn't the impossible creatures that had replaced the people. It was realizing that nothing in Millbrook had changed when I left. The lights are still on. The engines are still running. The coffee is still steaming. Time doesn't pass the same way there. And I am afraid that one day I might wake up in my own house and realize that I've already been gone for days. That my family has been looking for me, but I want to remember leaving. They remember the moment when something from Millbrook decided that I'd seen too much and came to take me back. They are not just in the town anymore. I see them sometimes in my peripheral vision. Shapes that didn't quite make sense. Figures standing too still in a crowd. Eyes that are too large, too black, watching me from strangers' faces. And I am starting to wonder if anyone else can see them. Or if I'm the only one left who knows what is really here, living among us, learning how to be human one stolen face at a time. The fear never stops. It just becomes your entire reality. Story 2. Desert road no one drives after dark. They'd driven Highway 375 through the Nevada desert maybe 100 times before that night. Never once did I think about the stories. You know, the ones. The creepy urban legends truckers swap at rest stops. The horrifying rumors that spread through CB radio channels. I figured they were just campfire tales people made up to pass the time on long hauls. I was wrong. So very wrong. The scary part wasn't that I didn't believe. The terrifying truth is that I should have. It was October, late in the month, and I was running behind schedule. I had 12 hours to get a load of equipment from Reno to Las Vegas, and the desert highway was the fastest route. The night was clear, cold, and impossibly dark. Out there, miles and miles from anything that resembles civilization, the darkness becomes a living thing. It presses against your windshield. It swallows your headlights. It makes you feel smaller than you've ever felt before. I was about 90 minutes into the drive when I first heard the story playing on the radio. Some host on an AM station was interviewing a paranormal researcher about a disturbing phenomenon that had been haunting that exact stretch of road for years. Truckers, experienced drivers who spent decades on American highways, had reported seeing figures standing motionless in the desert just beyond the roadside. Always the same stretch, always at night, always standing perfectly still in the headlights, watching the trucks pass. The unsettling part was that nobody could explain who these figures were, where they came from, or why they never moved. Just standing there, waiting. I should have switched stations. I should have laughed it off. Instead, I kept listening. The researcher explained that this eerie phenomenon had been documented for over 20 years. Dozens of drivers had called in reports. Some said they saw the same figures multiple times. Some said the figures seemed to move slightly, turning their heads as the trucks passed, though the chilling truth was that their bodies never moved. Their heads simply rotated, impossibly far. Some drivers described the creepy sensation of being watched even after they passed the figures, seeing them in their mirrors, still turning to follow. The fear was primal, the kind that made your spine go cold even thinking about it. The host asked if anyone had stopped to investigate. The researcher, whose answer was haunting. Nobody ever had. Every single driver had kept going. Every single one. I told myself it was nonsense. Entertainment. Something to fill the dead air on a late-night broadcast. but my hands had already started sweating on the steering wheel. The scary thing about the desert at night is how it messes with your perception. Distances become impossible to judge. The blackness beyond your headlights feels infinite. After about another 30 minutes of driving through that eerie darkness, I began to notice landmarks I recognized from previous trips. The old Joshua trees, the abandoned rest stop, the mile marker signs. I was getting close to the section the researcher had mentioned. The unsettling stretch where the figures supposedly appeared. My heart was already pounding. My mouth was dry. I kept telling myself that I was being stupid, that this was mass hysteria, that the power of suggestion was making my fear run wild. But knowing that didn't stop the creeping dread from settling into my chest like something alive and breathing. Then I saw the first figure. It was standing about 30 feet off the right side of the road, perfectly silhouetted against the starlit sky. Just standing there, not moving, not gesturing, just existing in that vast, horrible darkness. My first instinct was to hit the brakes, but I didn't. Something primal told me that stopping was the worst thing I could possibly do. Instead, I accelerated, my truck rumbled forward, and the headlights washed across that terrifying shape. In that split second of illumination, I saw it clearly. It was human, or at least, it had a human shape. Tall, impossibly thin. Its arms hung at its sides, and its head was tilted slightly, as if it was studying my truck as I passed. I couldn't see features. The light was too bright, the angle too harsh. But I could see that it wasn't moving. Not at all, just watching. The eerie sensation of being observed followed me down the road, and I had to fight the urge to check my mirror. My breathing had become shallow. My hands were gripping the steering wheel so hard my knuckles had turned white. I told myself I imagined it. A trick of the light. A scarecrow. Anything but what the creepy stories had described. But then I saw the second figure. This one was on the left side of the road, about 2 miles past the first. Same stance, same eerie stillness, same horrifying sense of being studied and judged by something that shouldn't exist. I didn't slow down. I didn't look directly at it. I just kept driving, kept my eyes locked on the road ahead, and tried to convince myself that this was all coincidence. 3 figures, 4, 5. They kept appearing, always spaced roughly 2 miles apart, always on alternating sides of the road, always standing in that same nightmare posture. By the time I seen the 5th one, the chilling realization had settled into my mind. I wasn't imagining this. This was real. This was happening. And I was driving straight through the middle of it. The terrifying questions started flooding my mind. Who were these figures? What did they want? Why were they just standing there, night after night, watching trucks pass? The darkness seemed to press closer as I drove, as if the desert itself was holding its breath. The only sound was the rumble of my engine and the occasional crack and pop of gravel under my tires. I tried to radio other drivers, but the CB was full of static. Nothing but white noise and occasional fragments of conversations that didn't seem quite right. I heard voices, but they sounded distorted, wrong, like they were being picked up from somewhere that wasn't quite real. The fear was becoming overwhelming now, the kind of primal dread that makes your brain scream at you to do something, anything, to escape. The 6th figure was different. It was standing right at the edge of the pavement, closer to the road than any of the others had been. As my headlights hit it, I realized why I felt such an intense wave of horror. This one had turned its head to face the road, to face my approaching truck. Its body was still perfectly still, but its head had rotated almost completely around, facing me directly. The unsettling wrongness of that movement, that unnatural angle, sent a shock of pure fear through my body. I swerved. I actually jerked the wheel without thinking, and my truck lurched across the center line. The figure receded into the darkness behind me, but when I checked my mirror, I realized something chilling. It was still looking at me. Even from behind the truck, even as I drove away, I could feel its gaze following. Watching, waiting. That is when I noticed the odometer. I'd been driving on this stretch for 45 minutes, according to my watch. But the odometer had only advanced 12 miles. That was impossible. Highway 375 is straight and clear. I should have covered at least 50 or 60 miles in that time. The terrifying realization hit me like a punch. I wasn't moving forward. Not really. No matter how hard I pressed the accelerator, no matter how fast my speedometer said I was going, something was keeping me on this horrible stretch of road. The scary part was that I was no longer alone. I could see them in the darkness now, the disturbing silhouettes moving in the desert beyond the reach of my headlights. Not standing anymore, moving, walking slowly toward the road. Their movements were jerky and unnatural, like something trying to remember how human bodies worked. The nightmare was becoming reality, and I was trapped in it. My truck, its engine began to sputter. It had been running perfectly fine just moments before, but now it was coughing and sputtering like something was choking off the fuel. The horror of this moment was overwhelming. I couldn't let this truck die on this road with these creatures closing in around me. The fear was so intense I thought my heart might actually stop. I gripped the steering wheel and pushed my foot down on the accelerator as hard as it would go. The engine roared. The truck jumped forward. The figures in the darkness seemed to pause, as if surprised by this sudden surge of speed. The terrifying chase was on, and I was racing against something I didn't understand. Something that had been waiting on this road for years, waiting for drivers like me. The odometer began to climb. 50 miles, 70 miles, 100 miles. The numbers were spinning faster than my speedometer suggested they should. The horrifying realization was settling into my mind. I wasn't in a normal part of reality anymore. I was in something else, something that didn't follow the usual rules. Then, as suddenly as they had appeared, the figures vanished. The darkness became normal. The road stretched out normally. My engine settled back into its regular rhythm. The fear and adrenaline were still coursing through my body, but the immediate danger seemed to have passed. I kept my speed high, kept my eyes locked on the road ahead. I didn't want to think about what had just happened. Didn't want to acknowledge the chilling truth. But the worst part was still to come. When I finally reached the outskirts of Las Vegas 40 minutes later, I checked my odometer. I somehow covered nearly 300 miles on that stretch of highway that should have only been 40 miles long. My watch said 2 hours had passed. The terrifying implications made my head spin. The unsettling truth was inescapable. Time and distance didn't work normally on Highway 375 after dark. I delivered my load and parked the truck. Then I went to a diner and ordered coffee with shaking hands. The creepy exhaustion I felt was beyond physical. It was like something had been drained out of me. I kept replaying the horrifying images in my mind. Those figures standing motionless in the darkness. Their heads rotating toward me. Their jerky movements as they advanced. But here, it's the thing that really haunts me. Here, it's the disturbing detail that keeps me up at night. When I got out to do my final safety inspection before bed, I found something chilling on the side of my truck. Scratches. Deep, deliberate scratches running down the entire passenger side. Not random damage from brush or debris. These were gouges made by fingers, by hands, scraping and clawing at the metal as if something had been trying to get inside. And underneath the scratches, in the dust that had settled on the truck, I found something worse. Handprints. Dozens of them. Small handprints, child-sized handprints, all pressing against the door. All trying desperately to get inside. I haven't driven Highway 375 since that night. I don't know what those figures are. I don't know why they were reaching for my truck. I don't know if they were trying to get in or trying to warn me away. But I know that somewhere on that dark desert road, between Reno and Las Vegas, something is still waiting. Something that stands motionless in the headlights and watches the trucks pass. Something that has been hungry for a very long time. Truckers avoid that stretch now. The scary rumors have gotten worse. They say that if you drive it after dark, you will see the figures. You will feel the fear. You will experience the unsettling sensation of time becoming meaningless. And if you very unlucky, if the creatures decide they want you, you might see something in your mirrors that will never leave your mind. Some drivers who made it through report seeing a figure that looks familiar. A figure that has their own face, standing in the darkness, waiting, watching, forever trapped on that horrible stretch of highway, standing motionless in the headlights of the next person foolish enough to pass through after dark. I sometimes wonder what they see when they look in their mirrors now. I wonder if they see me standing there. I wonder if the terrifying truth is that I never actually made it out of that desert at all. Maybe this is the nightmare. Maybe they've been driving that stretch of highway for the past 5 years, and I'm just too broken to understand it anymore. All I know for certain is that Highway 375 doesn't forgive. It waits patiently in the darkness. It waits for drivers just like you. And when the sun goes down and the desert becomes an endless void, those figures will be standing there, watching, waiting, and reaching out with those impossible hands. The creepy stories you hear at truck stops aren't warnings. They re-invitations, and if you were not very careful, they also prophecies. Before we continue, you need to understand something. Everything you've heard so far comes from real towns, real people, and real events. Stories most channels will never touch. On Vesper Shroud, we don't retell urban legends. We document the horror America tried to forget. If you want access to stories like these before they disappear completely, subscribe now. Because the next stories go deeper, and the last one changes everything. Story 3. Lock Sheriff. I found the sheriff's body on a Tuesday morning in October, and I still haven't told anyone exactly what I saw. Not the state police, not the newspapers, not even my own family. Some things are too scary, too disturbing, too unsettling to speak aloud. This is what happened in Millbrook, Ohio, and why I am telling you this story now, because I need someone to know the truth before the fear consumes me completely. My name is David Kerr. I was the assistant pastor at First Baptist in Millbrook, a town of about 2,000 people nestled in the rolling hills between Columbus and nowhere. The kind of place where everyone knows everyone, where the biggest scandal in recent memory was when the high school principal got drunk at the 4th of July picnic. Nothing terrifying ever happened here. Nothing dangerous. Nothing that would make your skin crawl at 3 in the morning. Sheriff Marcus Webb had been the law in Millbrook for 18 years. He was a man in his mid-50s, solid as a tree trunk, with the kind of voice that commanded respect. I see him at town council meetings, chatting casually about road maintenance and hunting season. He seemed normal, reliable, the kind of person you'd want protecting your community. I had no reason to believe he was anything other than exactly what he appeared to be, a faithful guardian of our small town, watching over us with steady hands and a clear conscience. Then came the night that changed everything. It started on a Friday evening around 9 o'clock. I was in my study at the church, reviewing notes for Sunday's sermon, when I heard sirens. Not unusual. Maybe someone had wrecked their car on Highway 7, or maybe there was a break-in at the gas station. I didn't think much of it. I kept working, but the sirens didn't fade. They grew closer, then louder, then seemed to circle back toward the sheriff's station downtown. My stomach tightened with that creeping, eerie sensation you get when something isn't right, even if you can quite put your finger on why. The next morning, I learned what had happened. Marcus had locked himself inside the jail. Not as a game, not as a prank. He had sealed himself in deliberately, checking every cell, every lock, every door twice, then triple-checking them. He radioed the deputy and told him absolutely no one was to let him out until daylight. Anyone who approached the building would be turned away. Under no circumstances was anyone to come inside. The deputy, confused but obedient, did as he was told. All night long, Marcus stayed in that jail, and according to the deputy's statement, he never slept. The lights stayed on. The radio went silent. By Saturday afternoon, the whole town was talking about it. The sheriff's office released a brief statement saying Marcus was investigating something, that there had been suspicious activity near the station, and that everything was under control. Nothing to worry about. I remember reading that phrase, nothing to worry about, and feeling the opposite. The fear was creeping up my spine like something alive, something with claws. I tried to find Marcus on Saturday. I drove to the station, but the deputy stopped me at the door. Marcus wasn't available. He was resting, she said, but her eyes told me something different. Her eyes were terrified. That, when I started asking questions around town, I talked to Sally at the diner, who mentioned she'd seen something strange near the forest edge on the outskirts of town around dusk on Friday evening. She didn't know what it was, just a shape. She said, dark and tall, moving between the trees in an unsettling way. No one paid attention. People see things in the shadows all the time. The mind plays tricks. But then I talked to Tom, who runs the hardware store. Tom said he heard scratching sounds at the back of his property on Friday night. Scratching that came from the direction of the woods. A sound so persistent and disturbing that he'd gone outside with a shotgun and fired warning shots into the darkness. The scratching stopped immediately. Whatever it was, it left. Or it hid. And there was more. Jenny, who works at the elementary school, mentioned that her husband had heard something howling in the distance, but not quite like a coyote or a wolf. The sound was wrong, she said. Twisted, like nothing that should exist in nature. All of this occurred on Friday night, the same night Marcus barricaded himself in the jail. The sheriff's office officially reopened on Monday morning. Marcus emerged looking like he hadn't slept in 2 days. His face was gray, his eyes were hollow, and his hands shook when he held his coffee cup. I saw him briefly at the town, this small coffee shop, and I approached him carefully, asking if he was all right, if there was anything the church could help with. He looked at me with an expression I'll never forget, a look of pure dread mixed with something else, something worse. Resignation, like someone staring into a chasm and knowing that eventually, inevitably, they would fall in. He told me nothing was wrong. Everything was fine. He'd just been doing paperwork. Just needed some quiet time to work. His voice was hollow, automatic, like he was reciting lines he memorized. But then he grabbed my arm, his grip almost painful, and he whispered 4 words that have haunted me ever since. They're still out there. I asked him what he meant. I pressed him, despite the fear that was now crackling through my entire body like electricity. But he released my arm, walked away, and never spoke to me about it again. The next 2 weeks were strange. Quiet, unnaturally quiet. No incidents, no disturbances, no sign of whatever Marcus had locked himself away from. The town settled back into its regular rhythm, and I tried to convince myself that it had been some kind of misunderstanding, a false alarm, nothing more. But I couldn't shake the feeling that something was watching us from the edge of the darkness. Something patient, something that knew we were here. Then, on a gray Thursday afternoon in late October, everything fell apart. I was driving home from a hospital visit around 5 in the evening when I saw the police cars. 3 of them, parked at odd angles near the forest that bordered the northern edge of Millbrook. My hands went cold. I pulled over and walked toward the scene, my heart pounding with a dread so intense it felt physical. A state police officer stopped me before I got close. There had been an accident, he said. No one was allowed past this point, but I could see enough. I could see the white sheet, already beginning to come loose in the wind. I could see the dark stains on the ground that looked like blood, only far too much of it, pooling and spreading and soaking into the dirt like the earth was drinking something horrible. Marcus was dead. The official story was that he'd driven off the road while alone near the forest. Single vehicle accident. The coroner ruled it an accident, though there were whispers about whether he deliberately swerved, whether he'd chosen to end things. The shame and stress of his job had finally gotten to him, people said. He'd broken under pressure. It happened. I knew that wasn't true. I knew, somehow, with a certainty that lived in my bones, that Marcus hadn't driven off that road by accident. That night, I couldn't sleep. I sat in my study with the lights on, doors locked, windows checked twice. And I tried to piece together what had really happened on that Friday night when Marcus locked himself in the jail. What had he seen in Millbrook? What had frightened a man so completely that he barricaded himself in a cell, stayed awake all night, and then, 2 weeks later, driven his truck directly into a tree at 40 miles per hour? I started investigating. I found the police reports, or what little was in them. The deputy on duty that Friday had noted possible wildlife disturbance in her log. Just 3 words, nothing more specific. I tried to talk to her, but she resigned from her position the day after Marcus died. She moved away. No forwarding address. I searched old newspaper archives at the library. I drove out to the edge of town at different times of day, looking for anything unusual. I interviewed people carefully, indirectly, never letting on that I knew something was wrong. And slowly, a picture began to form. There had been other incidents, small ones, easily forgotten and explained away. A family's dog had gone missing near the forest 5 years ago. Never found. A hiker had gotten lost in those woods 7 years earlier. Found 3 days later, dehydrated and traumatized, refusing to say what had frightened him so badly. A local man had gone camping near the forest boundary 8 years back and had killed himself 6 months later. Depression, the official cause read. But one of his friends told me, speaking only after making me swear not to use his name, that this man had seen something in the woods. Something that had stolen his peace of mind, his ability to sleep, his will to live. The forest that bordered Millbrook didn't have a name. No one hiked there. No one camped there. The hunters knew to avoid it. For years, no one had really thought much about why. It was just an accepted truth. That part of the forest was different. Off limits. Dangerous. Though no one could articulate exactly why. But Marcus had gone out there. On that Friday night, before he locked himself in the jail, he must have encountered something in that forest. Something so terrifying, so absolutely nightmarish, that it had broken a man of his composure and courage. I made a decision that I knew was dangerous, maybe even suicidal. I decided to go into the forest myself. I needed to know what was out there. I needed to understand what had driven Marcus to despair. I prepared carefully. I brought flashlights, water, a first aid kit, and my phone, though I knew reception would be spotty. I told my wife I was going for a nature walk and would be back by dark. I drove to the edge of Millbrook, parked my car at the forest boundary, and stepped into the trees. The temperature dropped immediately. I remember the shock of it, the way the air seemed to get thinner, more difficult to breathe. The sound of the town faded away completely. No distant cars, no barking dogs, no birds, just the crunch of my footsteps on the dried leaves and pine needles below. The further I walked, the more wrong everything became. The trees were twisted in ways trees shouldn't to be. Their trunks curved at unnatural angles, their branches interlocking overhead in a thick canopy that seemed to block out the fading light of the afternoon. The forest floor was unnaturally clear, almost swept clean, as if nothing had decayed here in a very long time. No mushrooms, no rotting logs feeding new growth, just silence and shadows and the terrifying feeling of being watched. I don't know how long I walked. Time seemed different in there, unreliable, but eventually I found something that made my blood freeze in my veins. It was a clearing, a perfect circle, as if some enormous entity had cleared away everything and left only bare earth. And in the center of that clearing, arranged in patterns, were bones. Not animals, not all of them, human remains, scattered and arranged with terrible precision. Skulls, femurs, rib cages, pieces of people, arranged in shapes that might have been symbols, though I couldn't comprehend their meaning. The bones were bleached white, ancient-looking, but also somehow fresh. There was flesh still clinging to some of them. I couldn't move. I couldn't breathe. The fear was so intense, so overwhelming, that my mind went quiet. All I could do was stand there and stare at the horrifying evidence of something that had been hunting people in this forest, collecting them, arranging them, keeping them. That is when I heard it. A sound like nothing on earth. A howl that wasn't the howl, a cry that wasn't anything human. It came from somewhere deep in the forest, and it echoed off the trees in a way that made my skin crawl. The sound was followed by the crack of branches breaking, the sound of something large moving through the undergrowth with terrible speed. I ran. I'd never run faster in my life. I crashed through the undergrowth, branches tearing at my face and clothes, my flashlight bouncing uselessly. Behind me, the sound continued, the cracking of wood, the wet, dragging movement of something enormous, the terrifying sense that I was being herded, chased toward something worse than whatever was behind me. I burst out of the forest and didn't stop running until I reached my car. I locked the doors, started the engine, and drove away, my hands shaking so badly I could barely hold the wheel. I didn't tell anyone what I'd seen. How could I? Who would believe me? And more importantly, what would happen if the authorities investigated? What if they sent people into that forest? What if more people disappeared? So they kept silent. They prayed every day since then, asking God for guidance, for understanding, for forgiveness for my cowardice. They watched Millbrook carefully, waiting for more disappearances, more frightening incidents. But there have been none. It is as if the thing in the forest, the chilling presence that had driven Marcus to madness, is satisfied with what it has. It is patient. It is waiting. And I understand now that Marcus didn't drive into that tree by accident. He was trying to protect the town. In his final moments, he came to the forest, and he did what he thought was necessary. He made a choice so that no one else would have to face what he had faced. I'm telling this story now because the fear is consuming me. Because I can't carry this burden alone anymore. Because someone needs to know the truth. If you were ever driving through Millbrook, Ohio, if you ever find yourself near that unnamed forest, don't stop. Don't investigate. Don't Let curiosity get the better of you. Stay in your car. Keep driving. And if you hear anything unsettling, anything eerie coming from those woods, that distant howl, that scratching in the darkness, that whisper that sounds almost like wind through the trees, but I send to quite done to investigate. Done to be like me. Done to be like Marcus. Some places aren't meant to be understood. Some darkness isn't meant to be illuminated. And some things, once you know they exist, can never be unknown again. They haunt you. They follow you into your dreams. They make you understand that the world is far more terrifying than you ever imagined. The fear doesn't stop. It just learns to live inside you, growing stronger with each passing day, until you can tell the difference between paranoia and truth anymore. That is what I learned in Millbrook. That is the horrifying secret I'm sharing with you now. And I hope, more than anything, that you never have to learn it yourself. Story 4. Church that rang its bells without power. I still hear those bells in my sleep. Not the pleasant Sunday morning kind that call people to worship. These were different. Wrong. Like something was screaming through metal. Let me tell you about Resurrection Falls, Nevada. Population 312. Or it was, before the power died and people started leaving. Before the priest disappeared. Before we realized that some things in the desert need electricity to wake up. I am a long-haul trucker. 42 years old. Driven every highway between California and Texas more times than I can count. You spend enough time on those lonely roads, you learn which towns to skip, which diners serve decent coffee, which motels don't have bed bugs. Resurrection Falls wasn't on my usual route, but that night in late September, a detour sent me straight through its heart. The sun was setting when I rolled in, turning the desert sky the color of a fresh bruise. The town looked abandoned. Not ghost town abandoned. Worse, like everyone had just walked away mid-sentence. A grocery cart sat in the middle of the parking lot. The gas station lights were dark. No cars on the street. The kind of empty that makes your skin crawl because you can feel eyes watching from behind those drawn curtains. I needed fuel. My tank was running low, and the next town was 60 miles out. But the pumps were dead. Everything was dead. No power anywhere. Not a single street light flickering to life as darkness fell. That is when I heard them. The bells. They came from the old church at the edge of town. A massive stone structure that looked like it had been built 100 years ago by people who believed God was something to fear. The sound rolled across the empty streets, echoing off the storefronts and closed-up houses. Deep, resonant, haunting. Each toll seemed to vibrate in my chest, making my heart skip. But here, it's the thing that made my blood turn cold. The entire town had no power. I'd seen it with my own eyes. Dead traffic lights, dark windows, not even a generator humming anywhere. So how are those bells ringing? Church bells need electricity to ring automatically. Unless someone was up there, pulling the ropes manually. I should have left, should have coasted on fumes until I found another town. But curiosity is a terrifying thing. It makes you walk toward the very danger your instincts are screaming to avoid. The church sat on a small hill, surrounded by dead grass and twisted Joshua trees. As I approached on foot, the bells kept ringing, steady, mechanical, every 30 seconds, like clockwork. The building itself was even more unsettling up close. Dark stone, almost black in the fading light. Narrow windows like suspicious eyes. A heavy wooden door that looked like it could seal a tomb. The bells stopped the moment I touched that door. Complete silence. So sudden it felt like going deaf. Even the desert wind died. I stood there, hand on the ancient wood, feeling my pulse hammering in my throat. Every nerve in my body said run. But I pushed the door open anyway. Inside, the church was cold. Not autumn evening cold. Deep, bone-penetrating cold that felt unnatural in the desert. The kind of cold that lives in caves and graves. My breath came out in visible puffs. The pews sat empty, arranged in perfect rows facing an altar draped in white cloth. Candles burned on either side. Dozens of them, casting dancing shadows that made the walls seem to breathe. But there was no electricity. I could see the dead light fixtures overhead. The silent sound system. Even the candles had been lit by hand. Someone was maintaining this place. Someone was here. Hello. My voice echoed too loud, bouncing off the stone walls and coming back distorted, like it had passed through something that changed it. Anyone here? Silence. Then, from somewhere above, in the bell tower, I heard footsteps. Slow, deliberate, moving across wooden floorboards that creaked with age. I found the stairs behind a small door near the altar. Narrow stone steps spiraling upward into darkness. The temperature dropped further with each step I climbed. My flashlight beam seemed weaker here, like the darkness was drinking the light. The walls were covered in something that looked like old water stains, but when I got close, I realized they were words. Hundreds of words scratched into the stone. Names, dates, prayers that didn't sound like any prayers I ever heard. Deliver us from the signal. The frequency is eternal. He hears through the bells. The footsteps above had stopped. Everything was quiet again except for my breathing and the blood rushing in my ears. I reached the top of the stairs and emerged into the bell tower. 4 massive bronze bells hung from ancient wooden beams. They were old, really old, the kind of craftsmanship you don't see anymore, covered in inscriptions in a language I didn't recognize. But what made me freeze was the man standing among them. He wore priest's robes, but they were filthy, stained with something dark. His back was to me, and he stood perfectly still, facing the largest bell. His hands were raised, not quite touching the metal, but close enough that I could see his fingers trembling. "Father," I said, my voice barely a whisper. He turned around. "You shouldn't have come here. Not when they..." Recalling. "Not when the frequency is active." His voice was wrong, too flat, like someone reading words they didn't understand. "What frequency? What are you talking about?" "The power went out 3 weeks ago," he said, still not turning. "Lightning strike took out the transformer. Should have been fixed in days. But it wasn't because they didn't want it fixed. Because something had been using the power lines, riding the current, waiting. The temperature dropped even further. I could see my breath hanging in the air like fog. When the electricity died, it should have gone quiet, should have stopped, but it didn't. It found another way, through the bells, through the frequency they create when they ring. It found a way to call without power, to speak without electricity." He finally turned around, and I saw his face, hollow, exhausted, eyes red from crying or lack of sleep or both. His hands were bleeding, palms torn and raw. "They've been ringing them," he whispered, "every 30 seconds, for 3 weeks. I can..." Stop. "If I stop, everyone hears it clearly. The real message, the one underneath the ringing. The one that makes people do things." "Makes them do what?" I asked, but I already knew. I'd seen the empty houses, the abandoned cars, the town that looked like everyone had walked away without warning. It tells them to leave, to walk into the desert, to find the source. And they do. They all do. I am the only one left, the only one still fighting it. As long as I keep ringing the bells the normal way, manually, I can drown out the other frequency. The one that broadcasts when the bells ring on their own. As if in response to his words, the largest bell began to move. Just slightly, a tremor that sent a low hum through the tower. The priest, his eyes went wide with fear. "No," he breathed. No. It's too soon. I just rang them. The bell swung harder, and a tone rang out that wasn't like any bell sound I'd ever heard. It was wrong, discordant, like someone had recorded a bell and played it backwards, underneath the normal sound. And beneath that, I could hear something else. Not words, exactly, but a pattern, a rhythm that my brain immediately wanted to follow, to understand, to obey. The priest grabbed my arm, his bloody hand leaving smears on my jacket. "Run. Get out of the church. Get in your truck and Dawn. Stop driving until you can, to hear anything but silence. Do you understand me, Dawn?" To listen to the pattern. Dawn, to try to understand it. But it was already too late. I could feel it working in my mind, like fingers pulling at threads. The bells were ringing faster now, all 4 of them, moving without anyone touching them. The sound was deafening, but underneath I could hear that pattern clearly now. It wasn't too random. It was information, coordinates, directions, a map written in sound, telling me exactly where to walk in the desert, exactly where everyone else had gone. I wanted to go, needed to go. The urge was overwhelming, like thirst or hunger magnified 1,000 times. My feet started moving toward the stairs on their own. The priest tackled me. We both went down hard on the wooden floor, and he was screaming words I couldn't hear over the bells, prayers or curses or both. He dragged me toward the stairs, and I fought him, because every cell in my body was telling me I needed to stay, needed to listen, needed to understand the complete message. We tumbled down the stone steps together, and the sound faded just enough for reason to creep back into my mind. The priest was sobbing now, pulling me through the church toward the door. The candles had all gone out, and in the darkness I could see other lights outside. Flashlights, dozens of them, coming from the houses, from the buildings, from everywhere. The townspeople, they'd been hiding, waiting, and the bells had called them all out at once. We burst through the church door, and they were there, 300 people standing in silent rows, all facing the church, all holding flashlights that created a sea of beams cutting through the darkness. Their faces were blank, empty, like whatever made them human had been temporarily switched off. They all try to stop us from leaving, the priest whispered. They don't want anyone to escape who knows, who has heard the pattern but hasn't followed it. We ran through the crowd of silent, staring townspeople toward my truck parked on the street below. They moved to block us, not aggressive, just stepping into our path with that same blank expression. We pushed through them, and their hands grabbed at us weakly, like they were moving underwater. I got the truck started, thank God for full mechanical systems that didn't need electricity. The priest jumped into the passenger seat, and I floored it, tires squealing as we tore down the main street. In the rearview mirror, I could see all 300 people turning to watch us go, their flashlights tracking our movement. Then, as one, they all turned and started walking into the desert, toward whatever was broadcasting through those bells. We drove for 2 hours before either of us spoke. The priest sat shaking, staring at his ruined hands. What is it? I finally asked. What is out there in the desert? I don't, he said. And that is the most terrifying part. Something found a way to communicate using electromagnetic frequencies, first through power lines, then through sound waves. The bells were built in 1887, long before electricity came to Nevada. Whoever made them knew. They built them to receive, to amplify, to broadcast. Broadcast what? An invitation, he said quietly. A way to call us home. Except home isn't to here. Isn't to anywhere on earth. And everyone who follows that signal, who walks out into the desert following those coordinates, they don't to come back. The desert swallows them. No bodies, no traces, just gone. I dropped him at a hospital in Carson City 2 days later. He was admitted for dehydration and psychological evaluation. Last I heard, he doesn't speak anymore. Just sits in his room, hands over his ears, rocking back and forth. I never went back to Resurrection Falls. The detour got permanently rerouted. Official records show the town was evacuated due to environmental concerns. The church was demolished 6 months ago. They said it was structurally unsound. But I still hear those bells sometimes, late at night when I'm driving through empty desert highways. Not with my ears, deeper than that, in my bones, in my teeth, a frequency that bypasses hearing altogether and speaks directly to whatever part of the brain processes pure fear. And the worst part, sometimes, just for a second, I understand the pattern. I know exactly where to go, exactly how far to walk into the darkness. And it takes everything I have not to pull over, get out, and start walking. Because something is still calling, still broadcasting, still hungry, and the bells never needed power at all. Story 5. Voices on Route 40. They've been a long-haul trucker for 23 years, and they heard things on the CB radio that would make your skin crawl. But nothing could have prepared me for what happened that night on Route 40, somewhere between the Oklahoma Panhandle and the Texas border. This is a true story. This actually happened to me. At 11:47 p.m., my rig was the only vehicle for miles across that empty stretch of highway. The road was pure darkness, the kind of creepy, suffocating darkness that exists only in the middle of nowhere, where civilization feels like it never existed at all. My headlights cut through the blackness like two pale ghosts, and the hum of the engine was the only sound keeping me sane. I'd been driving for 14 hours straight, and my eyes were starting to feel heavy. The coffee had worn off around mile marker 203. That's when I heard it. The CB radio crackled, a normal sound I'd heard 10,000 times before. But the voice that came through wasn't normal. It was a woman. This voice, thin and desperate, speaking words that made my exhaustion evaporate instantly. She was calling for help, an emergency, a traffic accident on Route 40, approximately 5 miles ahead at an unmarked crossroads. I sat up straighter in my seat, suddenly awake. That was my route. I was heading directly toward that location. I grabbed the CB mic and responded, offering assistance, saying I was nearby and would look for the accident. My voice sounded normal, professional, But inside my chest, my heart had started beating faster. Something felt wrong. That woman's voice had a quality to it that I couldn't place, something that registered as deeply unsettling, even through the static and distance. The response came immediately. She thanked me. Her gratitude was overwhelming, almost frantic, as if my answer had been the only thing keeping her from falling into complete panic. She described the location more specifically now. A town, she said. An old town. Millbrook. She said the accident had happened at the edge of Millbrook, and people needed immediate medical attention. My skin prickled with a horrible sensation of wrongness. I knew Route 40. I'd driven it countless times, and there was no town called Millbrook anywhere near my current location. I did memorize the major landmarks, the small communities, the gas stations and truck stops. Millbrook didn't exist on any map I'd ever seen. At least not anymore. I reached for my GPS on the dashboard, keeping one hand on the steering wheel as the endless highway stretched before me. I typed in Millbrook, Oklahoma. The screen thought for a moment, the way technology does when it's searching for something that doesn't exist. And then it displayed a result that made my mouth go dry. Millbrook had existed. According to the archive data, the town had been officially abandoned in 1987, officially declared a ghost town by state authorities after the population dwindled to zero. The GPS marked it with a small notation, abandoned settlement. Hazardous. Do not enter. The radio crackled again. The woman's voice returned, more urgent now. She was begging. People were trapped, she said, bleeding. A child was injured. The desperation in her voice was so genuine, so real, that doubt crept into my mind despite what the GPS was telling me. Could there be an error? Could someone actually be out there, in or near that abandoned place, calling for help? I told her I was coming. I thought, do you know why I said it? Every instinct I had was screaming at me to keep driving, to change the channel, to ignore this impossible voice calling from a town that didn't exist. But that desperation, that raw human need for help, was too much to ignore. I pressed the accelerator slightly harder, and my truck surged forward into the darkness. The next 15 minutes felt like driving into a horror movie. The highway was completely empty. No other vehicles. No lights from towns or farmhouses. Just infinite blackness in every direction, broken only by the beam of my headlights and the pale glow of my dashboard. The voice on the radio continued, describing injuries, describing panic, describing a horrifying scene that I was apparently rushing toward. Then something changed. As I drove, the radio began picking up other voices. Multiple people now, all on the same frequency, all in Millbrook, all calling for help. A man, his voice said the accident was catastrophic. Another voice, another woman, spoke about injuries that sounded nightmarish. A child, this voice, thin, frightened, lost, called out for its mother. The communication network was becoming chaotic, overlapping, frantic. It was the kind of emergency response you'd expect from a real disaster unfolding in real time. But it was coming from a town that had been dead for nearly 40 years. My headlights caught something up ahead, a shape, a sign. As I drew closer, my stomach dropped. An old welcome sign, weathered and broken, stood at an angle beside the highway. The letters were barely legible, but I could make out the name, Millbrook. Below that, painted in faded green and gold, some kind of civic emblem. The sign itself was covered in dirt, and several large pieces were missing, as if something had come through and torn them away. I eased off the accelerator and rolled slowly past the sign. The CB radio voices continued their desperate pleas, their descriptions of chaos and suffering. But now I could hear something else underneath the voices. Something in the background of the radio transmission. It sounded like wind, or breathing, or something much worse. The entrance to Millbrook appeared through my windshield like a gateway to another world. The old highway branched off toward a town that seemed to exist in perpetual twilight, even though it was the middle of the night. The buildings I could see in the distance were dark, decrepit shapes, their windows like hollow eyes staring out at nothing. The road leading into town was cracked and broken, with grass and weeds pushing up through massive cracks in the asphalt. It looked like no one had traveled this road in decades. I knew I should keep driving. Every rational part of my mind was screaming at me to ignore the voices, to change the channel, to report this to actual authorities once I reached the next town. But the voices on the radio were so convincing, so terrifyingly real, that something inside me couldn't to let go of the possibility that people actually needed help. I turned my wheel and guided my massive rig onto the road that led into Millbrook. The moment my truck left the main highway, the voices on the CB became crystal clear. Suddenly there was no static, no fade, no distance. It was as if I'd gotten impossibly closer to the broadcast, or as if the broadcast had suddenly decided to include me directly. The woman, this voice returned, no longer desperate but almost welcoming. She said they'd been waiting for me. She said I was the first one in a very long time. She said they'd been alone for so many years, and now someone had finally come back. The buildings of Millbrook emerged from the darkness like teeth from a grin. The town stretched out before me, block after block of abandoned structures. Storefronts with dark windows, houses with sagging roofs, a church with a crooked steeple. Everything was wrong about this place. The wrongness went beyond simple decay and neglect. There was a quality to it that made my skin crawl. A feeling that this wasn't just a place where people had left, but a place where something had gone terribly, fundamentally wrong. The creepy silence of the abandoned town was broken only by the idle of my truck, this engine. The CB radio voices had stopped. Complete silence. The absence of sound was almost worse than the desperate pleas had been. I realized I was driving deeper into Millbrook, South Main Street, and I couldn't remember making the decision to do so. The steering wheel seemed to guide itself, pulling me forward. I noticed something that made my blood turn to ice. On the buildings around me, on the windows and doors and walls, there were handprints. Not fresh handprints, but old ones. Dozens of them. Hundreds, maybe. Handprints pressed against the glass and painted on the brick, as if people had been trying to get out. Or trying to get in. The prints were all placed at different heights, and some of them appeared to be very small. Child-sized, the CB radio crackled to life again, but this time there was only one voice. Not the woman, something else. Something that sounded like multiple people speaking in perfect unison, creating one unified voice that was almost inhuman. It said a single sentence that made my stomach turn inside out. It said, "Welcome home." I slammed on the brakes. My truck skidded slightly, the weight of the cargo threatening to take control. Dust clouds rose around my headlights, glowing in the pale beams like something alive, something conscious. I sat there, shaking, my hands gripping the steering wheel so hard my knuckles turned white. The inhuman voice on the radio repeated the same phrase, "Welcome home. Welcome home. Welcome home." Then, as suddenly as it had come, the voice vanished. The static returned, the CB crackled and hissed with empty, normal radio noise. I looked around at the town surrounding me, at those haunting handprints on every building, at the profound wrongness of this place, and I made a decision that I think saved my life. I reversed my truck. The maneuver with a full rig isn't easy, especially not when you panicked and your hands are shaking so badly you can barely work the pedals. But I managed it. I gunned the engine, grinding into reverse, and I backed my truck down the cracked main street of Millbrook as fast as I dared. The wheels bounced over broken asphalt, and my cargo shifted dangerously in the trailer, but I didn't care. All I wanted was to get out of this town, to escape this place that shouldn't exist and shouldn't to be calling out on radio frequencies meant for living people. As I reversed back toward the main highway, something caught my eye in the rearview mirror. A figure, a person standing in the middle of the street behind me, watching my truck disappear. I couldn't see the figure clearly. The headlights were pointing the wrong direction, and the darkness was too complete, but I could feel it watching me. The gaze was heavy, ancient, and profoundly terrifying. I spun the wheel, straightened out, and shot forward onto Route 40, putting as much distance between myself and Millbrook as the speed limit in my truck's power would allow. My heart was hammering in my chest, and my hands were shaking so violently I had to slow down just to stay on the road. Every few seconds, I glanced in the mirror, expecting to see the figure following me, or the town reaching out to pull me back. But there was nothing, just empty highway and darkness. For the next hour, I drove in complete silence. I didn't touch the CB radio. I didn't turn on the satellite radio or any music. I just drove, fighting the exhaustion that was still trying to drag at my consciousness, staying alert, staying sharp, putting miles between myself and that terrifying place. Then, around 1:30 a.m., the CB radio crackled to life again. This time, it was a different voice, a male voice, calm and professional, the voice of another trucker. He said he was on Route 40, about 20 miles behind me. He said he was heading to New Mexico for a delivery. Just a normal transmission. Normal communication between drivers on the highway. I responded to him, grateful to hear a human voice that seemed real, that seemed to come from the living world. We exchanged standard trucker talk, comments about the road conditions, the weather, the state of the highway. Normal, mundane conversation that felt like a lifeline back to reality. But then, about 5 minutes into our conversation, the other trucker mentioned something that made my spine seize up. He said he was passing through a town called Millbrook. He said his GPS was acting strange, showing the town as abandoned, but he could see lights in some of the buildings. He said there appeared to be people moving around inside the structures. He was thinking about stopping to investigate. I jumped on the radio so fast I nearly dropped the mic. I told him not to stop. I told him to keep driving, to not deviate from the main road, to not acknowledge any radio calls coming from that location. I tried to explain what had happened to me, but I could hear the skepticism in his response. He said I was probably tired, that my mind was playing tricks on me, that there was probably a logical explanation for everything. I never heard from that trucker again. I drove all through the night and into the next morning, stopping only for fuel and bathroom breaks at chain gas stations where there were other people around. The sunlight made me feel safer, but not completely better. Something had changed inside me. The world felt less solid than it had before. I made it to my delivery in Albuquerque without incident, but I couldn't stop thinking about what had happened. I went back and researched Millbrook obsessively. I found old newspaper articles about the town. In 1987, the population had started dying from some kind of unknown illness. No autopsy results were ever made public. No cause was ever officially released. The state simply declared the town abandoned and closed off access to it, putting up barriers on the roads leading in. But those barriers were gone now. Either they'd been removed or they simply deteriorated beyond recognition. The horrifying part came when I found an old census record from 1980, about 7 years before the town was abandoned. Millbrook had a population of 1,847 people. The newspaper articles from 1987 mentioned that when the state officials came to investigate the deaths and quarantine the town, they found 0 living residents. All 1,847 people had vanished or died without explanation. But here, it's the part that still makes my blood run cold when I think about it. I looked at the old police reports from when the town was being investigated. During their initial search, officers reported hearing voices on the radio. Voices of people trapped in the town, calling for help, describing injuries, describing a nightmarish situation unfolding in real time. The official report said it was likely a malfunction of the communication equipment, or perhaps residual radio signals from before the evacuation. But those voices had been heard in 1987, and I had heard them again, nearly 40 years later. The same desperate voices, the same descriptions of chaos and injury, the same overwhelming need for help. I stopped driving Route 40 after that night. I changed my routes entirely, even though it meant taking longer trips and making less money. I told myself I was being irrational, that there was definitely a logical explanation for what had happened. Maybe some kind of radio phenomenon, some trick of atmospheric conditions or radio wave transmission that I didn't understand. But I knew better. I knew the experience was real, and I knew it was dangerous. About 6 months after my encounter with Millbrook, I heard something on the news that made my hands start shaking. A family of 4 had gone missing somewhere in the Oklahoma Panhandle. Their car had been found on Route 40, near an old abandoned town. The official report said they'd probably run out of gas and gotten lost on a back road. Search and rescue teams were looking for them. They were never found. The newscast included a detail that made me absolutely certain they were connected to Millbrook. It said that during the initial search, highway patrolmen reported hearing voices on their two-way radios. Multiple voices, possibly belonging to the missing family, coming from an empty area of highway where no transmission should have been possible. The voices were calling for help, describing injuries, begging for rescue. By the time rescue teams reached the location where the signals were strongest, there was nothing. No evidence of the family. No indication that anyone had been in that area recently. I never reported my experience to anyone. I know how it would sound. I know people would think they had a breakdown, that exhaustion and driving all those hours had made me imagine the whole thing. And maybe they'd be right. Maybe I did imagine it. But I know what I experienced, and I know it was terrifying. The truth is, I think Millbrook is still calling. I think it has been calling for nearly 40 years, broadcasting on the CB radio frequency at night, using the voices of the people who died there to lure other drivers into its boundaries. And I think once you enter Millbrook, you become part of it. You become one of those voices, forever calling for help on the radio, trying to convince the next isolated driver to pull off the main road and come into town. Sometimes, late at night, when I can sleep, I think about that moment when I saw the figure standing in the street behind me. I wonder if it was just one of the trapped souls from Millbrook, or if it was something else entirely. Something that has been waiting in that town for decades, feeding on the drivers and travelers who stop and investigate those desperate radio calls. And every time I drive the highways of America, no matter what route I am on, I keep my CB radio off during the night hours. Because I know, with absolute certainty, that if I turned it on, I would hear that voice again. That unified, inhuman voice. It would say those two words that still echo in my nightmares. Welcome home. And I am terrified that one night, exhausted and alone on an empty stretch of highway, with the darkness pressing in from all sides, I might just be tired enough to actually respond to that call. Story 6. House the heat couldn't be touched. I first noticed the house on a Tuesday morning when the temperature hit 110 degrees. I was driving through rural East Texas, between nowhere and nothing, on a job that paid better than it should have. The kind of job where questions dawn to get asked. I was inspecting properties for a development company, documenting abandoned homes across 40 counties. Easy work, boring work, except for what I found on Miller Road. The Texas heat was suffocating. My air conditioning was barely keeping up. The asphalt ahead shimmered like water that would never touch ground. Every living thing in that part of the state understood one simple rule. When it gets this hot, you stay inside. You stay still. You stay alive. The sun was a terrifying, merciless thing that killed without mercy. Then I saw it. The Victorian house sat back from the road, maybe a quarter mile down a gravel drive lined with dead oaks. 3 stories of faded blue paint, broken shutters, and a wraparound porch that sagged under the weight of decades. It looked like every other decaying mansion in rural Texas. Haunted looking, sure. Creepy and unsettling, absolutely. But nothing that explained what would happen next. I checked my GPS coordinates. Yes, this was on the list. The property had been flagged in our database with a single note, atmospheric anomaly. Previous inspectors, inconclusive. I parked maybe 50 yards away and stepped out. The heat hit me like walking into an oven. My shirt was already soaked. Sweat dripped into my eyes before I even closed the car door. This kind of heat doesn't just make you uncomfortable. It makes you question your existence. It makes death feel like an option, not a threat. I walked toward the house. I didn't know how to explain what happened next. But I'll try because you need to understand. About 30 feet from the front porch, the temperature dropped. Not gradually, instantly. It was like walking through an invisible wall. 60 degrees. Maybe colder. The shock made me stop in my tracks. My sweat felt ice cold against my skin. I could see my breath coming out in small clouds. In the middle of 110-degree Texas summer, I was suddenly watching my breath freeze. This was impossible. I stepped backward. The terrifying heat rushed back like a predator. I stepped forward again. Cold. Behind me. Heat. In front of me. Something wrong with the world. I must have done this 5 times, standing in that strange threshold, unable to believe my own body, my own senses. The air around the house felt different. Heavy, like the atmosphere itself had turned hostile and was watching me. There was no wind inside that cold radius. The air was perfectly still, suffocating in its own way, like being inside a refrigerator that someone sealed shut. I looked down at my thermometer, a digital device I always carried for documentation. It read 43 degrees Fahrenheit. Outside the invisible boundary, it would read 112. Inside, the cold was absolute and unnatural. Fear started working its way up my spine. Not reasonable fear, primal fear, the kind that makes you understand, at a cellular level, that something is deeply wrong. I forced myself to walk toward the porch. This was my job. I had rationalized explanations already forming. Underground spring that cooled the foundation. Unusual geological formations. A cave system beneath the structure creating airflow. Science had answers for everything. Science didn't believe in horror. The closer I got to the house, the more I realized I was wrong. The creepy atmosphere intensified. The air felt thick and suffocating despite being cold. I could taste something metallic on my tongue. The house looked worse from close up. The windows were black inside, not just dark from shade, but black like they had been painted from the inside. The front door hung slightly ajar, revealing nothing but darkness beyond. A nightmarish nothing that seemed deeper than physically possible. I pulled out my phone to take photographs for the report. That is when I noticed something that made my blood freeze harder than the temperature around me. Every window on the visible side of the house was sealed shut. Not locked, sealed, nailed, boarded, welded by time and something else. Someone had worked hard to make sure nothing could get in or out of those windows. The door, the only entrance, was the same way. Multiple locks, chains, hasps. Not to keep people out, to keep something in. My hands were shaking now. Genuine, terrifying fear mixed with the physical shock of the cold. I took a breath and my lungs hurt. The air was too cold to breathe deeply. Everything about this place screamed danger. Every instinct in my body was telling me to run, to get back to the suffocating heat, to the normal world where things made sense. But I needed answers. I pushed the front door open further. The hinges made a sound like something alive and suffering. Inside was darkness so complete and suffocating it felt like a physical presence. Not the absence of light. A presence. A thing that lived in the shadows and didn't to appreciate being disturbed. My phone, its flashlight beam cut into the black. I saw the entrance hall. Wooden floorboards, rotted and warped. Furniture overturned. The walls were covered in something that looked like stains or marks, but the light wouldn't defocus on them. They seemed to move away from the beam like they were avoiding being seen. Then I heard it, a sound from deeper inside. Not a creak or settling wood. Something else, something like breathing. Slow, rhythmic, patient breathing coming from the darkness in the house. Something inside that house was breathing. Every horror story I'd ever heard, every creepy tale from childhood, every nightmare I'd ever forgotten, crashed together in my mind. This was evil. Not metaphorically, not symbolically. This was something that qualified as evil in the truest sense. Something that didn't want to be found or documented or exposed. I backed out of the door. My rational mind was dying. The part of me that explained things away was suffocating under the weight of what I was experiencing. The house was watching me. The cold was a warning. The darkness inside was intentional, a barrier, a defense mechanism against the living world outside. I walked around the perimeter of the property, staying in the cold zone, documenting everything. The back of the house was the same. Windows sealed, doors locked, but the foundation was strange. There were cracks in the brickwork that went deep. The ground around the base was discolored, stained with something dark and ancient. The earth itself seemed contaminated. I found something near the back corner that stopped my heart. Photographs, old ones, scattered in the dirt like someone had thrown them out a window decades ago. I picked one up with shaking hands. A family, mother, father, 3 children, standing in front of the house. They looked terrified. Their faces were pale, their eyes wide with a fear that transcended normal human emotion. The photograph was dated 1934. I found more. Same family, different dates. The children looked progressively worse. Thinner, sicker. The last photograph showed only the parents. The children were gone. The date on that one was 1937. 3 years. Whatever happened inside that house took 3 years to consume them. The breathing sound from inside grew louder. Not louder exactly, closer, like whatever was inside had noticed I was still there. The cold intensified. I could no longer feel my fingers. The metallic taste in my mouth became overwhelming. This wasn't just about the temperature anymore. This was about presence. This was about something ancient and hungry recognizing a living creature just outside its cage. I ran. I sprinted through that cold zone back to my car, my lungs burning with the effort of breathing frigid air. Behind me, the house seemed to lean forward, as if trying to reach me with invisible hands. I didn't look back until I was in the car and had the engine started. The moment I drove away, the heat crashed down like a hammer. 112 degrees. Suffocating. Real. Normal. But I knew the truth now. That normal world was the lie. The house was the truth. Cold. Hungry. Patient. I sat there for a long time before calling it in. My report to the company was simple. The property could not be developed. No reason given. Some properties, I wrote, should remain undisturbed. I recommended it be left alone indefinitely. The next inspector was sent anyway. He lasted 15 minutes inside the cold zone before driving away. His report said only, something is wrong with that place. Don, to send anyone back. The development company removed the house from their list permanently. It exists on no official records anymore. No utility companies service it. No tax assessor has visited in decades. It's as if the world collectively decided to forget it exists. But the house hasn't forgotten. Every summer, when the heat reaches 110 degrees, someone drives down that gravel road. Maybe they curious. Maybe they redrawn by something they can explain. Maybe the house is calling to them. They feel the cold before they see the house. They see the sealed windows. They hear the breathing inside. And most of them drive away. But not everyone, because the house is still growing cold when it should be burning hot. The house is still breathing. The house is still waiting. And somewhere inside that darkness, in that suffocating impossible space where light can reach, something has been keeping score since 1934. Something is counting the years, counting the visitors, waiting patiently for someone who won to run. The terrifying truth is this: the house the heat couldn't touch ISN to broken. It was not a mistake or anomaly. It was functioning exactly as intended. And if you drive down that road on a day when the temperature reaches dangerous levels, you might feel that sudden, shocking cold. You might see the blackened windows. You might hear that slow, patient breathing from inside. And something tells me that this summer, someone won to leave. I drive past sometimes on my way through Texas. I never stop, but I always feel it watching from behind those sealed windows. Cold, hungry, waiting for the day when curiosity wins and someone pushes past fear. The house the heat couldn't touch is still there, still cold, still breathing, still waiting. Story 7. Missing school bus. I was 15 years old when I rode the bus that day. The bus that never arrived anywhere. The bus that disappeared into something that shouldn't exist. What I'm about to tell you is the truth. And it's the most terrifying thing I've ever experienced in my life. It started like any other Wednesday afternoon in rural Texas. The kind of day where nothing seems important, where you were just thinking about homework and dinner and whatever show you were going to watch that night. The creepy part was that we should have known something was wrong from the very beginning. The bus pulled away from Westmore High School at exactly 3:15 in the afternoon. There were only 8 of us on board that day. 8 teenagers heading home on a route that had been the same for years. Our driver was Mr. Hansen, a guy who'd been driving that route for nearly 2 decades. Everyone trusted him. He was careful, professional, the kind of person you never worried about. That's what made what happened next so horrifying. We'd only been driving for about 20 minutes when Mr. Hansen turned onto Old Ridge Road. It's when the unsettling feeling started creeping into my stomach. I remember noticing that the road had gotten really quiet. No traffic, no houses, just endless fields of dry Texas grassland stretching out on both sides of the pavement. The kind of isolated place that makes you feel very small and very alone. The scary thing was how straight that road was. It just went on and on, perfectly straight, disappearing into a vanishing point on the horizon. I remember thinking it was unusual because most roads in that part of Texas have curves and dips and variations. But this one was disturbingly uniform, like it had been drawn on a map without any regard for the actual terrain. Mr. Hansen had been quiet all afternoon. That wasn't unusual, but something about his silence felt different. His hands were gripping the steering wheel harder than normal. His jaw was clenched. I caught his eyes in the mirror a few times, and they looked worried. Scared, even. The creepy feeling in my gut started getting worse. One of the other kids, a girl named Sarah who sat near me, asked if we were going the right way. Nobody answered her. Mr. Hansen just kept driving. The terrifying silence that followed was the kind that makes your skin crawl. It was like the bus itself was holding its breath. That is when I noticed the fence. It ran along the right side of the road, a long line of weathered wooden posts strung together with barbed wire. The fence didn't seem to have any purpose. There were no fields behind it, no animals, no property that it was protecting. It just stood there, creating a barrier between the road and nothing. The eerie feeling of wrongness was growing stronger in my chest. I couldn't explain it, but something about that fence made me deeply uncomfortable. The wood was gray and cracked, like it had been exposed to decades of Texas heat and wind. Some of the posts were leaning at disturbing angles, as if something heavy had been pushing against them from the other side. When I looked at the left side of the road, I saw something that made my blood run cold. The landscape had changed. Where there should have been open grassland, there was now a dark forest. Thick trees pressed right up to the edge of the pavement, their branches intertwining overhead in a way that seemed almost intentional. The scary part was that I couldn't remember when these trees had appeared. One moment we'd been driving through open field, and the next we were surrounded by this dense, nightmarish woodland. The shadow beneath those trees was so deep and dark that I couldn't see more than a few feet into it. Sarah noticed it too. She made a small sound, something between a gasp and a whimper. The other kids were starting to notice now. There was movement on the bus, nervous shifting, uneasy glances. The terrifying atmosphere was becoming impossible to ignore. Mr. Hansen, his knuckles had turned white from gripping the steering wheel. His breathing was getting heavier. I could see his chest rising and falling in the mirror. The creepy silence was broken only by the rumble of the bus engine and the sound of our tires on the asphalt. Then the odometer started acting strange. I noticed it because I'd been watching the mile markers. We passed mile marker 47 about 10 minutes earlier. But the next time I looked, we were at mile marker 45. We were going backwards, or the road was bending in some impossible way. The horrifying realization hit me that we weren't actually moving forward anymore. We were stuck in a loop, trapped in some kind of nightmare geography that didn't follow normal rules. My heart started pounding so hard I thought I might actually have a heart attack right there on the bus. The fear was becoming overwhelming, the kind of primal terror that made it hard to breathe. I wanted to scream, but something told me that screaming would be the worst thing I could do. Something told me that sound carried differently on this road. When I looked back at Mr. Hansen, his face was pale. His eyes were wide. He was gripping the wheels so hard his whole body was shaking. The disturbing realization was settling into my mind. Our driver was terrified. If he was scared, we should be absolutely petrified. That is when the shapes appeared. They were standing in the forest on the left side of the bus. Tall figures, impossibly thin, their bodies perfectly still, just watching the bus pass. The eerie sensation of being observed by something other than human was overwhelming. I couldn't see their faces. The darkness beneath the trees was too thick. But I could feel their eyes following us, could sense the hunger in their attention. One of the younger kids, a boy named Tommy who was maybe 12, started crying. Real tears streaming down his face. The creepy silence that followed was worse than any scream could have been. It was like the whole world was holding its breath, waiting for something terrible to happen. Mr. Hansen did something then that I'll never forget. He took his foot off the accelerator. Not the brake, the accelerator. The bus started to slow down, not because we were braking, but because he was letting off the gas. The bus coasted forward, losing speed, and as it did, those shapes in the forest started moving. They were running alongside us now, keeping pace with the slowing bus. The terrifying rawness of their movement was indescribable. It was like watching something trying to remember how human legs worked, like they were learning to run by imitating memories of actual people. The scary part was how fast they were moving. They were keeping pace with a bus that was still doing maybe 30 miles per hour, running through thick forest without tripping, without slowing down, without any indication of effort. Sarah was screaming now, so were some of the other kids. The fear had become too much to contain. The horrifying sound of their screams echoed through the bus, bouncing off the metal walls and the windows. But Mr. Hansen didn't speed up. He just kept letting the bus coast, kept his eyes locked on the road ahead. I stood up. I didn't know why I did it. It was stupid and reckless, but the panic in my chest was demanding action. I moved toward the driver's seat, toward Mr. Hansen. The terrifying question was burning in my mind. What was happening? Where were we? What were those things? Mr. Hansen saw me in the mirror. He shook his head, just once, a simple gesture that said everything. Don, to ask, Don, to interfere, Don, to do anything that might make this worse. The eerie calmness in his face, despite the horror of the situation, was somehow more frightening than panic would have been. The bus was down to 20 miles per hour now. The shapes in the forest were getting closer. I could see them moving between the trees, could hear the sound of their breathing, a wet, rasping sound like something pulling air through lungs that weren't quite right. The unsettling realization was hitting me hard. These weren't the animals. They weren't the human other. They were something else, something that existed in the spaces between those categories. Then Mr. Hansen did something that changed everything. He hit the accelerator hard. The bus lurched forward so suddenly that everyone was thrown back in their seats. The engine roared, a sound of desperation and fear and something else I couldn't identify. The creepy shapes in the forest fell away, unable to keep pace with the sudden burst of speed. We were flying down that straight stretch of road now, flying faster than a school bus should ever go, flying away from those horrifying figures. But the worst part was still to come. I could see the road ahead clearly now through the front windshield. And what I saw made my blood turn to ice in my veins. The road didn't continue forward. About half a mile ahead, the asphalt just ended. There was no gradual transition to dirt or gravel. The scary, disturbing reality was that the pavement simply terminated in the middle of nowhere, and beyond it was nothing but darkness. A thick, impenetrable darkness that seemed to exist outside of normal space. I looked back at Mr. Hansen. His face was set in a mask of grim determination. His jaw was clenched so hard I thought his teeth might break. He was accelerating even faster. The speedometer was hitting 40, 50, 60 miles per hour. The terrifying truth was becoming impossible to ignore. He was going to drive this bus directly into that darkness. He was going to do it without hesitation. The shapes were back. They emerged from the forest on both sides of the road now, running, leaping, their movements becoming increasingly frantic and violent. The eerie sound of their existence, that wet rasping breath combined with the sound of bare feet on pavement, was all around us. The horrifying sensation of being hunted, of being prey in a nightmare hunt, was overwhelming every sense. We were maybe 300 feet from the end of the road. My instinct was to grab the steering wheel, to try to force us back, to do anything to prevent what I knew was about to happen. But something stopped me, something in Mr. Hansen's eyes. A strange combination of acceptance and purpose that suggested he knew something I didn't. That maybe, just maybe, the only way out was forward. 200 feet. The shapes had caught up to the bus now. They were alongside us, running alongside the windows, their bodies pressed against the glass. I could see them clearly now, and the horrifying reality of what they were made me want to scream. They weren't demons or monsters. They were people, or at least they had been. Their faces were twisted and wrong, their proportions disturbing, but there was something almost familiar about them. Something that suggested they had once been human. 100 feet. Mr. Hansen, his eyes met mine in the mirror one last time. And in that moment, I understood. This wasn't the first time he'd driven this road. He'd done this before, many times. The creepy realization was that we weren't experiencing something new. We were caught in something that had been repeating for years, for decades, maybe. The bus hit the end of the road at nearly 80 miles per hour. For one impossible moment, we were suspended in midair, all of us hanging weightless, the bus tilting forward into the darkness. The terrifying sensation of falling, of being pulled into something vast and terrible and utterly incomprehensible, was the most intense fear I've ever experienced. And then we were through the darkness, and everything changed. We landed on the road on the other side, the same straight stretch of Old Ridge Road, but different. The sun was lower in the sky, different shadows, different angle of light. The terrifying realization hit me like a punch. Time had passed. Hours, maybe, but we'd only been driving for what felt like minutes. Mr. Hansen pulled the bus over to the side of the road. His hands were shaking violently. His entire body was trembling with exhaustion or fear or something I couldn't identify. The creepy silence that followed was the kind that makes you want to scream just to hear a normal sound. The other kids were quiet now. Not the peaceful quiet of people at rest, but the horrible silence of trauma. The silence of people who've seen something their minds done, who want to process. Sarah was staring out the window with eyes that seemed to look through the glass into nothing at all. Tommy had his head in his hands, his small body shaking with silent sobs. We sat there for a long time, maybe 10 minutes, maybe longer. Time felt strange now, unreliable. The unsettling sensation of reality being different than it had been before was impossible to shake. Then Mr. Hansen started driving again. We continued on Old Ridge Road like nothing had happened. When we finally reached the residential area where kids got dropped off, everything was normal. Regular houses, regular cars, regular life. The scary part was how jarring the normalcy felt. How wrong it seemed after what we experienced. I got off the bus at my stop and walked home in a daze. When I arrived, my parents were sitting in the living room looking at their phones. My mother glanced up and seemed confused to see me. When I checked the time, it was already 7 in the evening. School had let out at 3:15. The terrifying realization was that 4.5 hours had passed. But on the bus, it had only felt like 30 minutes. The next day, I found out that the school had been calling parents all afternoon. The bus had been reported missing. The police had been searching for us. Apparently, the bus had simply vanished from the road. Highway patrol found something eerie on Old Ridge Road. Tire tracks. The scary detail was that the tracks started in the middle of the pavement and just stopped. No gradual deceleration. No indication of the bus turning around. The tracks just ended in the middle of nowhere, as if the bus had simply ceased to exist. Mr. Hansen never came back to work. The school authorities questioned him, but his story was that he had no memory of what happened. The horrifying truth was that none of the other kids remembered much either. They remembered the road, they remembered the forest, they remembered the shapes, but the details were fuzzy, dreamlike, as if their minds were refusing to process the full reality of what they experienced. Only I remembered everything with perfect clarity. Every eerie detail was burned into my memory. The creepy sensation of those shapes running alongside the bus. The terrifying moment when we drove off the edge of the road into that darkness. The chilling realization that we somehow come out the other side, in a different time. I tried to tell my parents. I tried to tell the police. But the unsettling truth was that no one believed me. They thought I was traumatized. That my mind was inventing details to make sense of something it couldn't. Do you understand? The disturbing reality was that they were probably right. But here is what I know. Here is what keeps me awake at night. Every few weeks, I see Mr. Hansen driving that same route. Not with the school, just the bus, empty, driving Old Ridge Road in the late afternoon. And sometimes, I see other buses too. Buses that disappeared years ago from different schools in different counties. All driving together on that eerie stretch of road. All heading towards something that exists just beyond the edge of normal reality. And sometimes, late at night when I can sleep, I drive out to Old Ridge Road. I park on the shoulder and I watch. I watch for the shapes in the forest. I watch for the other buses. And sometimes I see them. The scary truth is that I am starting to feel pulled toward that road. The creepy sensation of belonging there is getting stronger every day. I am 17 now. 2 years have passed since I rode that bus. And I realized something chilling. I haven't aged a single day. My friends have grown. My parents have aged. The world has moved forward. But I'm exactly the same as I was that afternoon. The horrifying realization is that I'm no longer entirely in your world. I am caught between, partially still on that road, partially still driving toward that darkness. Sometimes I wonder if you were reading this right now because you were one of us too. Because you know what happened. Because you've ridden a bus that disappeared. The eerie truth might be that there are more of us than anyone realizes. More buses, more roads, more people caught in the spaces between where reality bends in ways it shouldn't. Old Ridge Road is still out there. The bus still runs. The shapes still wait in the forest. And one day, one of them might be waiting for you. All you have to do is take that route home. Story 8. Motel. I've been driving for 6 hours straight, and I still can't explain what happened at the Riverside Motel, or why I'm the only person who walked out of there alive. But I am going to tell you now, because the police want to listen. The state investigators have closed their file, and I'm running out of time before the fear completely consumes me. My name is Daniel Stone, and I'm an insurance adjuster. I spend my life traveling to small towns across America, investigating claims, filing reports, living a life so ordinary and boring that my friends joke I should write a documentary about watching paint dry. I drive lonely highways, stay in forgettable motels, eat at diners where the coffee tastes like rust and the pie is always apple. It's not exciting, but it's safe. Or at least, I thought it was. Everything changed on a Tuesday night in Nevada, about 40 miles outside of Vegas, at a motel that shouldn't exist anymore. I'd been driving since dawn, heading toward a property claim in Reno. The highway had been empty for hours. Nothing but desert stretching out endlessly in all directions, the kind of landscape that makes you feel very small and very alone. My eyes were burning, my shoulders ached, the sun was dropping fast, turning the sky that particular shade of orange that only exists in the desert, beautiful and terrifying at the same time. That is when I saw the sign. The Riverside Motel. Vacancy. The neon flickered and buzzed. Some of the letters burned out, but the message was clear enough. I needed to sleep. My eyes were closing on their own. I took the exit and followed a cracked asphalt road that curved away from the highway, disappearing into darkness. The motel emerged from the shadows like something from another era. It was old, genuinely old, the kind of building that belonged to the 60s or 70s, before anyone cared about maintenance or fresh paint. The office was a small structure attached to a long corridor of rooms, maybe 20 units arranged in a perfect line. A few lights flickered on in random rooms, creating an unsettling pattern that made me deeply uneasy. The parking lot was half full, a collection of cars that all looked like they'd been sitting there for days. I should have kept driving. Something about this place screamed danger. The atmosphere was thick, oppressive, like walking into a building where something terrible had just happened or was about to. But exhaustion won out over instinct. I pulled into a parking space near the office and killed the engine. The night air was cold, far colder than it should have been in the desert. My breath misted. The motel was silent, unnaturally silent, without the normal sounds of a functioning place. No voices, no televisions, no ice machine humming, just an eerie, suffocating quiet that felt like it had weight. I walked to the office and pushed open the door. The manager was a thin man in his 60s, with skin like old leather and eyes that seemed to look through me rather than at me. He sat behind a desk, staring at nothing, his expression completely blank. The office itself smelled like mildew and something else, something organic and slightly sweet, like meat left in the sun too long. He didn't greet me. He didn't ask my name or how many nights I'd be staying. He simply slid a registration card across the counter and pointed to a room number with one bony finger. Room 17. His hand was shaking slightly. I tried to make conversation, tried to ask about nearby restaurants or gas stations, anything to break the suffocating silence. He didn't respond. He just stared past me at the wall. His jaw clenched so tightly I could see the muscles working. Something felt very wrong. The fear was starting to creep up my spine. That ancient instinct that tells you when you in danger. But I was exhausted, and hotels with strange managers weren't too scary. They were just awkward. I paid cash, took the key, and walked back out into the cold night. Room 17 was at the far end of the corridor. As I walked, I noticed the rooms I passed. All the doors were closed. All the curtains were drawn, but through cracks in the fabric, I could see that the lights were on in every single unit. Every room occupied, every room silent. The eerie feeling intensified. Inside room 17, everything was exactly as it had been decades ago. The carpet was the color of old blood, stained with things I didn't want to examine too closely. The furniture was heavy and dark, the kind of pieces that absorbed light instead of reflecting it. The bathroom mirror was cloudy with age. The shower curtain had a faint smell of mold. I tried the television. It came on with a static hiss, showing only white noise. I turned it off quickly, unsettled by the sound. I should have left. I should have gotten back in my car and driven through the night to Reno, exhausted or not. But I was already here, and I was so tired that even this horrible room seemed inviting. I locked the door, pushed the deadbolt home, and climbed into bed. Sleep came immediately, a deep and dreamless dark that felt like drowning. I woke at 3 a.m. My heart was pounding for no reason I could identify. There was no sound, no disturbance. Nothing to explain why my body had jerked me awake with such violent urgency. I lay in the darkness, listening, waiting for the thing that had woken me to reveal itself. Then I heard it, footsteps outside my door, not walking toward my room or away from it, just standing still, standing right outside. Someone was standing in the corridor outside my door, and they were breathing. Heavy, wet breathing, the sound of someone struggling to breathe through a blocked nose. I held my breath. The footsteps didn't move. The breathing continued for what felt like an eternity, then gradually faded as the person walked away, back toward the office. I didn't sleep for the rest of the night. When dawn came, gray and weak through the dirty windows, I packed my things quickly and went to check out. The parking lot was the same as it had been when I arrived. All the cars were still there. Nothing had changed. The manager was in the office, sitting in the exact same position, staring at the exact same spot on the wall. I put my key on the counter and tried to leave. He spoke for the first time since I arrived. His voice was hoarse, like it hadn't been used in months. He told me that guests don't leave the Riverside Motel. They check in, but they never check out. Their cars stay, their rooms stay, but the guests themselves simply vanish, disappearing into the building as if they never existed at all. He said this matter-of-factly, without inflection, like he was reading from a script he repeated 1,000 times. Then he looked at me directly for the first time, and his eyes held something that looked like pity. He told me I wouldn't be able to leave. No one could. The motel had its own rules, and I accepted those rules when I signed the registration card. I didn't argue. I didn't question him. I walked directly out of the office, got into my car, and drove toward the highway. Part of me expected the car not to start. Part of me expected the road to lead me back to the motel, no matter which direction I drove. But the car started smoothly, and the road was clear, and within minutes, I was back on the main highway, racing toward Vegas in safety. But something was fundamentally wrong. I made it to Vegas. I drove directly to the police station and told them everything. The terrifying motel, the strange manager, the way he claimed guests never left, the way all the rooms were occupied but silent. The officer I spoke with didn't seem surprised. In fact, he seemed to have been waiting for someone like me to walk through that door. He pulled up a file on his computer and showed me a series of missing persons reports. 17 people, all disappeared within the last 5 years. All had last been seen checking into the Riverside Motel. All had left their cars in the parking lot. All had simply vanished. But when I asked him why they hadn't shut the place down, why they hadn't raided the motel and rescued the missing people or found bodies, his answer chilled me more than anything else that had happened. He told me that every time law enforcement tried to investigate, the building was empty. Completely empty. No guests, no manager, no furniture, no sign that anyone had ever stayed there. The rooms were bare and clean, as if the building had been abandoned for decades. But the cars were always still there, parked in the lot, locked, with no sign of damage or forced entry. The officer gave me the coordinates of the motel, and he told me to go back. He said there was a team waiting, that they'd been tracking this place for years, and that they needed me to help them understand what was happening. I drove back into the desert. When I reached the exit, when I followed the cracked asphalt road back toward where the motel should have been, my car began to fail. The engine sputtered, the radio died, and the building that emerged from the darkness was different now. It was enormous, impossibly large, stretching out into the distance in both directions, a massive structure of concrete and rust. The parking lot was full of cars, hundreds of them, maybe thousands, all facing the building, all empty, all waiting. The manager stood in the parking lot, watching me. He wasn't alone. Behind him, partially visible in the shadows, were shapes, human shapes, dozens of them, maybe hundreds, all standing perfectly still, all staring in my direction. And I understood. The motel didn't trap people by locking doors or using force. It trapped them by promise, by the terrifying knowledge that once you understood what it was, once you really grasped the nature of the place, you couldn't leave. The understanding itself became the cage. I got back in my car, the engine started, and I drove away, back toward the highway, back toward the life I knew. But I know the truth now. I know what the Riverside Motel is. I know that it's waiting. I know that every time I see a motel on a lonely stretch of highway, I'm seeing its echo, its possibility, its hunger. And I'm starting to wonder if I actually left at all. Sometimes I look in the mirror and don't quite recognize the person looking back. Sometimes my hands look too long, too thin. Sometimes when I speak, my voice sounds like it is coming from very far away. And every night, when I try to sleep, I hear that wet breathing outside my door, getting closer, waiting for the moment when I finally understand that I never really left. The Riverside Motel doesn't exist on any map. But I drive the same highway now, back and forth, in a loop I can escape. And every night, when I pass an exit in the darkness, I wonder if that is where it is. If that is where it's always been. The horror I ascend to the motel itself. The horror is the realization that some places aren't meant to be escaped. Some places own you the moment you step inside. And the fear, the deepest, most terrifying fear, is understanding that you might already be there, right now, reading this story, thinking you safe at home, never realizing that the walls around you aren't quite the right shade of real. Story 9. Wind that carried names. The wind knows your name. That is what they told me when I moved to Dustfield, Arizona. I laughed it off as small-town superstition, the kind of creepy folklore that makes desert communities feel more mysterious than they are. But after 3 months of hearing my own name whispered through the darkness during every windstorm, after watching what happened to the others who heard theirs, I'm not laughing anymore. I am a contractor, 38 years old, divorced, no kids. When the housing development job came up in Dustfield, I jumped at it. Good pay, 6-month project, cheap rent. The town sat right on the edge of the Sonoran Desert, one of those places that appears suddenly after miles of nothing, like someone dropped a handful of buildings onto the sand and called it civilization. Population 800. 1 main street, 2 bars, a diner that served breakfast all day. The locals were friendly enough, but they had this way of watching the sky that made me uncomfortable. Like they were waiting for something. Every evening around sunset, people would head inside early, lock their doors, close their windows tight even in the punishing heat. I asked my landlord about it during my first week. She just smiled this tight, worried smile and said, I understand soon enough. Said the wind gets strange out here when it blows in from the deep desert. Said some sounds aren't meant to be heard, and some names shouldn't be spoken by anything that isn't human. I thought she was trying to scare the newcomer. Give me a good local ghost story to tell folks back home. Then the first windstorm hit. It came at night, like they always do. I woke to the sound of something howling across the desert, a low moan that rose and fell like a living thing in pain. The walls of my rental house creaked. Sand peppered the windows in waves. I lay in bed listening to the storm build, and that is when I heard it. My name, not shouted, not called, whispered, like someone was standing right next to my ear. Lips almost touching my skin, breathing my name into the darkness. Michael. Soft, intimate, terrifying. I sat up fast, heart hammering. The room was empty. Shadows danced across the walls from the streetlight outside, but I was alone. The wind screamed around the house, and there it was again. Michael. Clearer this time, unmistakable. My name carried on the wind, woven into the sound of the storm itself. I told myself it was auditory pareidolia, the same thing that makes people hear voices in white noise or see faces in random patterns. The brain trying to find meaning in chaos. But the way my name sounded, the exact pronunciation, the familiar rhythm of those 3 syllables, it was too perfect, too deliberate. The storm lasted 4 hours. I heard my name 67 times. I counted everyone, lying rigid in bed, too frightened to move, too rational to believe what was happening. When the wind finally died and silence returned to the desert, I was covered in cold sweat despite the heat. The next morning, I asked around. The construction crew wouldn't talk about it. They just exchanged these knowing looks and changed the subject. The waitress at the diner got real quiet when I mentioned the wind. Finally, old Eddie at the hardware store told me what I needed to know. The wind had been doing this for decades, maybe longer, long before the town was officially founded. Native tribes used to avoid this stretch of desert entirely, called it cursed ground where the dead speak. When settlers came in the 1880s, they started noticing it too. Windstorms that carried voices, names whispered in the night, and people who heard their names too many times, who listened too carefully, they started changing. Eddie said it happened slowly at first. People would become distracted, distant. They stare out at the desert during the day like they were looking for something. They wake up in the middle of the night and walk to their windows, pressing their faces against the glass, watching the darkness. Then, during the next windstorm, they hear their name again, and eventually, they answer. That's when they walk out into the desert and never come back. I should have left right then. Should have packed my truck and driven straight back to Phoenix. But the money was too good, and I kept telling myself it was just wind. Just sound. Nothing supernatural. Nothing dangerous. Just a weird acoustic phenomenon that the locals had built mythology around. The second storm came 5 nights later. I was ready this time. I researched audio hallucinations, bought earplugs, even recorded the wind on my phone to analyze later. But when that terrifying whisper came through the darkness, when I heard Michael spoken in a voice that sounded almost like my ex-wife, almost like my dead mother, almost like my own voice, the earplugs did nothing. Because the sound wasn't coming from outside, it was inside my head, bypassing my ears entirely, speaking directly into my mind. I ripped the earplugs out and sat in the center of my bed, trying to control the fear that was crawling up my spine like insects. The wind howled. My name echoed through my thoughts. Michael, Michael, Michael. Each repetition felt like fingers pulling at something deep in my brain. trying to hook into whatever part of me recognized my own identity. Then I heard other names too. Dozens of them, hundreds, carried on the same wind, whispered in the same chilling tone. Jessica, Robert, Thomas, Maria, an endless litany of names, all spoken with that same unsettling intimacy. I realized with horror that the wind was calling everyone in town simultaneously. Every person locked in their homes, hearing their own name repeated endlessly through the darkness. But most disturbing was what I noticed when I listened closer. Some names were spoken more frequently than others, and the ones repeated most often belonged to people I met. People who had that distant, distracted look. People who stared at the desert a little too long. I started keeping track. Every windstorm, I could count how many times I heard my name. After the third storm, I was up to 214. After the fourth, 368. The number kept climbing, and I noticed myself changing. I did catch myself staring out the window at work, looking at the endless expanse of sand and scrub brush. I did wonder what was out there, what was calling, why it knew my name. At night, I did dream of walking into the desert, following a voice that promised answers, that promised to explain everything if I did just come a little closer. Then Sarah disappeared. She worked at the grocery store, always friendly, always smiling. I watched her change over the past month, watched that distant look creep into her eyes, watched her start positioning herself near windows, near doors, anywhere she could see the desert. When the next windstorm hit, I heard her name on the wind almost as often as my own. Sarah, Sarah, Sarah. The morning after the storm, her car was parked in her driveway, keys still in the ignition, driver, this door hanging open. Her front door was unlocked. Her phone was on the kitchen counter, but Sarah was gone. The sheriff organized a search party, and we found her footprints leading straight out into the desert, barefoot, walking in a perfectly straight line toward nothing. The tracks just stopped after 2 miles. Not faded, not obscured by wind, just stopped, like she'd been plucked off the ground mid-step. 3 more people disappeared over the next month. All of them had heard their names hundreds of times. All of them had walked out into the desert during windstorms. None of them came back. I tried to leave, packed everything into my truck, quit the job, headed for the highway. But 15 miles out of town, a windstorm hit. In the middle of the day, in clear weather. Impossible, but it happened anyway. The wall of sand appeared out of nowhere, engulfing the road, reducing visibility to nothing. And through that churning chaos of dust and debris, I heard my name. Louder than ever before. Michael, Michael, Michael. The wind pushed against my truck like massive hands, forcing me backwards, back toward town, back toward whatever was calling. I fought the steering wheel, but the wind was too strong. It deposited me back at my rental house and then vanished. Clear skies again. No wind, no storm, just me, shaking in the driver's seat, understanding that I wasn't allowed to leave. Not anymore. That night, I did something desperate. I broke into the town records office, searching for answers. What I found in those old documents made everything so much worse. Dustfield had been built on top of something. An excavation site from the 1920s. Archaeologists had discovered a series of tunnels beneath the desert, carved by an unknown civilization thousands of years before native tribes arrived. The tunnels went deep, descending miles into the earth. The expedition team had gone down to explore. None of them came back, but their journals survived. I found them in a box marked Historical Curiosities. The entries started normal enough, describing the tunnels, the strange symbols on the walls, the way sound echoed in impossible patterns through the underground chambers. Then the entries got disturbing. They found something down there, something that communicated through vibrations, through resonance, through sound itself, something that learned their names. The last entry was barely legible, written in a shaking hand. It described how the thing in the deep places had started calling to them, using their names, pulling them deeper into the tunnels. The archaeologist wrote that he could hear his own name echoing up from the darkness below, and he knew if he descended one more level, he'd understand. He'd finally know what was calling. The journal ended there. The tunnels were sealed with concrete and dynamite. The town of Dustfield was built on top of the blast zone, like they were trying to bury the whole incident under normal life. But you seal away something that exists as sound, as vibration, as frequency. It had been down there all along, calling through the rock, through the sand, through the desert wind. Learning new names, collecting them, waiting for people to listen closely enough, long enough, to finally answer. Last night, I heard my name 4,000 times. The windstorm lasted 8 hours. By dawn, I found myself standing at my back door, hand on the knob, ready to walk out into the sand. I caught myself just in time, but barely. I know what is going to happen. I can feel it building. The next storm will be the one. The pull will be too strong. The voice will be too familiar, too comforting, too impossible to resist. I'll hear my name spoken one more time, and I'll answer. I'll walk out into that vast desert darkness, following the sound down, down, down into the deep places beneath the sand. And I'll finally understand what has been calling all along. The wind is picking up now. I can hear it starting to build outside my window. Any minute now, the storm will hit. Any minute now, I'll hear my name again. Michael. There it is. I'm walking to the door. I can't stop myself. The voice is so clear now, so insistent. It's not wind. It's never been wind. It's something old and patient and hungry. Something that speaks in frequencies our ancestors learned to fear. My hand is on the doorknob. The desert is calling. And God help me, I'm going to answer. Story 10. Town that erased itself. I have a question for you that will sound insane, but I need you to listen carefully. What happens when a town decides it doesn't want to exist anymore? I'm not talking about abandonment or decay. I'm talking about something far more terrifying, a place that actively removes itself from reality, erasing its own evidence from maps, from records, from human memory itself. This is my story of what happened in Ravensbrück, Colorado, and how I watched a town commit suicide. It started with the maps. I work as a surveyor for the State Highway Department, a job that kept me driving through remote areas of Colorado for 15 years. The pay was decent, the work was routine, and I mapped every inch of the high country without incident. Until the day I noticed something deeply unsettling. A town I surveyed just 6 months prior had vanished from my updated GPS and my digital maps. Ravensbrück, population 847, located at mile marker 203 on Highway 285, nestled in a valley between the San Juan Mountains. I'd been there multiple times. I remembered the general store with the creaky wooden floors. I remembered the church on the corner with its white steeple. I remembered the motel where I stayed during the 1994 survey work. But when I pulled up my current map database, the town didn't exist. I assumed it was a database error. Software glitches happen. I thought nothing of it until I started getting calls from other surveyors, cartographers, and road maintenance crews. They were all reporting the same impossible thing. Ravensbrück was disappearing from maps, not gradually fading due to some administrative change, but actively vanishing as if the town had never been marked in the first place. The state sent out an official team to investigate. I was part of that team. We drove Highway 285 on a cold October morning, heading to the coordinates where Ravensbrück should have been. The drive was eerie because I kept expecting to see the town appear on the horizon, but the landscape remained empty. Just mountains, forests, and endless empty roads stretching ahead. Then we saw the sign. At first, I thought we passed it because I wasn't looking carefully enough. But no, the old green highway sign that should have read, Ravensbrück, 10 miles, was blank. Completely blank. The painted letters had somehow been removed or erased, leaving just a bare metal rectangle bolted to the wooden post. It was as if someone had taken the sign down, cleaned it meticulously, and bolted it back up. My supervisor pulled the truck over. We all got out, standing on the shoulder of the highway, staring at this blank sign in the middle of nowhere. One of the younger guys, Danny, tried to photograph it for documentation. His camera worked fine, but when he looked at the photo on the screen, the sign in the image was completely normal. The painted letters showed up perfectly in the picture. Ravensbrück, 10 miles, clear as day. Danny, his hands were shaking as he showed us the photograph. None of us could explain it. The sign in front of our eyes was blank. The sign in the digital image was detailed and complete. We stood there in the creeping darkness of late afternoon, all of us feeling something deeply wrong descending upon us like a weight. We continued driving toward where Ravensbrück should have been. The eerie tension grew with every mile. The landscape started changing in ways that made no sense. The road curved differently than I remembered. Landmarks that had been visible from the highway were gone. The forest seemed to be closing in, pressing against the asphalt, as if the wilderness was trying to reclaim the road itself. Then we came around a bend, And we saw it. The town was still there. The buildings stood exactly where they should have been. The general store with its weathered facade, the church with its white steeple, the small cluster of houses spreading up the hillside. Everything was in its proper place, looking exactly as I remembered it. Except for one terrifying detail. The town had no name. Every sign that identified the place, every indication that this settlement had a name or an identity, had been removed. The highway sign leading into town was blank, just like the one we'd seen miles back. The sign above the general store was blank. The church marquee was blank. Even the mailboxes visible from the road had their numbers scraped away, leaving only bare metal. My supervisor pulled the truck to the side of the road near the town entrance. We could see Ravensbrook clearly from where we sat. People were moving around inside the buildings. Through the general store window, I could see a figure standing behind the counter. Through the church windows, I could see people sitting in the pews. The town was inhabited and operational, but it had been systematically stripped of every identifier that would tell us who and where we were. Danny wanted to drive into town and investigate. The rest of us opposed the idea. Something about the place was fundamentally wrong, deeply unsettling in a way that made my instinct scream at me to leave. But my supervisor overruled us. This was an official state investigation. We needed answers. The moment our truck crossed into the town limits, the temperature dropped. I could see our breath suddenly visible in the cab, even though it had been relatively warm just seconds before. The shadows between the buildings seemed darker than normal shadows, more solid somehow, as if the darkness had weight and presence. We parked in front of the general store. Through the window, I could clearly see the figure behind the counter. But the moment I looked directly at that figure, something shifted in my perception. The person was there and not there simultaneously. When I focused on the peripheral areas of my vision, I could see the figure clearly. But the instant I tried to look directly at them, my eyes refused to focus. It was like trying to read text in a dream. The harder you concentrate, the more it blurs. My supervisor got out of the truck first. Danny and I followed, though every fiber of my being was screaming at me not to. The air of the town smelled wrong. There was a chemical odor mixed with something organic and decaying, an unsettling combination that made my stomach turn. We entered the general store. The proprietor was still there, still visible in my peripheral vision but refusing to come into focus when I looked directly. The store shelves were completely empty. Not abandoned, not picked clean by scavengers, but empty in a way that suggested they had never contained merchandise at all. The shelves were there, but they had no purpose, no connection to any function they were meant to serve. My supervisor asked the figure behind the counter what was happening to the town. The figure moved its mouth, but no sound came out. Not no audible sound, a complete absence of sound, as if the figure, this attempt to speak, existed in a reality that didn't include noise. My supervisor repeated the question, his voice sounding thin and frightened in the strange silence of the store. The figure pointed toward the back room. We followed that gesture through a doorway into the back area of the store, and what we found there made all of us stop moving. The room was filled with signs, hundreds of them, wooden signs, metal signs, painted signs, carved signs. Every sign that should have existed in Ravensbrook. The town name signs, the business signs, the street signs, all of them stacked in this room like discarded evidence. But they weren't the old signs that had been taken down years ago. Some of them still had fresh paint. Some of them looked like they had been removed just hours before we arrived. One sign, I remember clearly, had paint that was still wet to the touch. It was a sign for Ravensbrook High School, and the paint on the letters was still tacky. My supervisor ordered us back to the truck. We didn't argue. We ran. The fear was palpable now, a terrifying certainty that something fundamentally dangerous was happening in this place, that we needed to get out immediately. As we reached the truck, I looked back at the general store. Every person who had been visible through the windows was now standing outside, facing us. I couldn't see their faces clearly. They refused to come into focus, but I could feel them watching us. The shadowy figures stood in perfect stillness, not moving, not gesturing, just existing in the spaces between the buildings with an oppressive patience that suggested they were waiting for something. We drove out of Ravensbrook at a speed that would have gotten me fired under normal circumstances. Once we crossed back over the town line, the temperature normalized and the air cleared. I could breathe again. The nightmare began after we left. Within 24 hours, Danny started forgetting things. He couldn't remember his son, his name, though he knew he had a son. He couldn't to remember his address, though he knew where his house was located. The information was there in his mind, but it was becoming increasingly obscured, like trying to read a message written in disappearing ink. Within a week, Danny had to be placed in a care facility. He'd forgotten his own name. His driver's license had become blank, the information somehow erased from the laminated card itself. His family photos began to lose detail, faces becoming blurred and unidentifiable. My supervisor lasted longer, about 3 weeks. He started with the forgetting, names, dates, memories. But it progressed further. He began to forget how to recognize objects. He'd look at a cup and not understand what it was for. He'd see a car and know it was important somehow, but the word car had vanished from his vocabulary. His mind was being systematically erased, starting with details and working inward toward the core of his identity. I tried to warn the authorities what had happened, but my reports were dismissed. The town of Ravensbrück no longer appeared in any database, on any map, in any official records. There was no evidence it had ever existed. When I tried to drive back to the location where the town had been, I found only empty forest. The road didn't curve the same way. The clearing where the buildings had stood was gone. The terrifying part is that I'm starting to forget too. I can still remember what Ravensbrück looked like, what it smelled like, how the shadows moved differently there. But the details are slipping away. I keep trying to write down what I remember, but sometimes I'll read over what I've written and realize it doesn't make sense. Words are missing. Sentences are incomplete. It is as if whatever happened to that town, whatever power of erasure it possesses, is slowly reaching out toward anyone who remembers it. I think I understand now what happened in Ravensbrück. The town didn't abandon itself. The people didn't leave. Instead, Ravensbrück made a collective decision to remove itself from existence entirely. They erased the town, its identity, from every record, every map, every database. And they were still there, still existing in that location, but existing in a state that denies their reality. They were becoming invisible, unmappable, unrememberable. And anyone who enters that town and witnesses the erasure becomes infected with it. We start to forget. Our own identities begin to dissolve the same way Ravensbrück dissolved. I've stopped driving through that region. I've tried to avoid thinking about what happened because thinking about it makes the forgetting worse. But I know the town is still there. I can feel it sometimes, at night, like something pressing against the edge of my consciousness. It is calling out silently, drawing people toward it, infecting them with its erasure. The creepy truth that keeps me awake at night is this. There are dozens of other surveyors and state employees who were tangentially connected to Ravensbrück documentation. We're all forgetting things now. We're all experiencing the same slow dissolution of memory and identity that consumed Danny and my supervisor. And somewhere in Colorado, on Highway 285 at mile marker 203, a town that no longer exists is waiting for the next person to get close enough to remember it. Because the only way for the town to remain unremembered is to keep spreading its forgetting to everyone who witnessed its erasure. I'm writing this now because I'm terrified that if I dawn to document it while I still can, I'll forget completely. I'll wake up one morning and this entire nightmare will be gone from my mind. I'll be another blank face driving through the mountains, unaware that a town is slowly consuming my identity. The horror I send to the town itself. The horror is knowing that it is still here, still hungry for forgetting, and there is nothing anyone can do to stop it. If these stories disturbed you, remember, Texas has hundreds more towns just like these. Subscribe to Vesper Shroud, because the scariest stories are always the ones no one was meant to hear.